Hey guys, tonight we wander together into a world where the gas lamps burn low, their glow swallowed by thick fog that curls through narrow alleyways like a living thing. You step softly along cobblestone streets slick with mist, the sound of carriage wheels echoing against brick walls, as if the city itself has a heartbeat. The air smells of coal smoke, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like soot clinging to every surface. There's a chill that seems to seep into your bones, and you can't help but draw your shawl or blanket tighter around yourself. This is Victorian London, a city of clattering horse hooves, flickering lanterns, and children who are expected to be as prim and proper as the iron gates around the townhouses that loom above you. And if you're not, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this era with a smile. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a quick comment to let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you, whether you're curled up at midnight in Mumbai or nodding off after lunch in Los Angeles. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly through the fog, every step clicking against uneven stones. Around you, the city murmurs. A coach rattles by, a watchman's lantern swings, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks at nothing. This is not the polished, romantic London of costume dramas, all sparkling chandeliers and elegant ballrooms. This is the city of the 1800s, when coal smoke blackened the skies and the air was so thick with soot that doctors warned children not to play outside on certain days. Of course, children were rarely asked what they wanted. They were expected to do as they were told, to obey without question, and to fit into a mold designed by their parents or employers. You pass a narrow row house where a family is returning home from church. The father, tall in his black coat, walks with a stiff back and the confidence of someone who knows that every eye on the street is watching him. Appearances matter more than comfort in this world. The mother, her waist pinched into a corset so tight it seems a wonder she can breathe, carries a sleeping infant while her eldest daughter holds the hands of two younger siblings. The children's clothes are tidy but itchy-looking, the sort of starched wool and linen that scratch and pinch but show the neighbours that the family has money. Historians still argue whether Victorian society's obsession with appearances was primarily about morality, about class distinction, or about a deeper anxiety as the industrial world shifted everything people thought they knew. But you can feel it in the way the mother tugs at a loose thread on her glove, embarrassed to be seen imperfect. And as you continue your slow stroll, you notice a group of boys running past, each clutching a wooden hoop. They should be laughing, but instead they move in near silence, eyes darting back toward the houses, as if one wrong shout might invite punishment. The idea of children should be seen and not heard wasn't just a witty saying here, it was a law of the household, spoken or unspoken. A child who raised their voice at the wrong moment could find themselves scolded, grounded, or even struck. Now you might be thinking, wait, I'd never survive this. I can barely sit through dinner without checking my phone. And honestly, same. Imagine sitting ramrod straight for hours, sipping weak broth in silence while your father lectures on the importance of moral fibre. Compared to that, our modern dinner table arguments about whose turn it is to the dishes almost sound fun. But for a Victorian child, family dinners were as much about discipline as about food. Eating was a performance. Chew quietly, don't reach across the table, don't ask questions unless spoken to, and definitely don't slouch. A straight back was seen as a reflection of strong character, and drooping shoulders hinted at moral weakness. It wasn't just about posture, it was about reputation, honor and self-control drilled into children before they could even tie their shoes. The houses themselves seem complicit in this rigidity. You step closer to a dining room window and peer inside. Heavy curtains are drawn against the cold, casting the room in a dim glow. Oil lamps flicker against wallpaper patterned with faded roses. The children sit on the edge of their chairs, their small feet not quite touching the floor. They hold their spoons as if the silver itself might scold them for clumsiness. You can almost hear the scrape of porcelain as they carefully avoid making a sound with their utensils. Of course, not every home was like this. Some families, particularly those outside the bustling city, lived in warmer, looser households where children were hugged and allowed to laugh. Some Victorians wrote diaries filled with fond stories of family picnics, rambunctious games, and parents who were tender and affectionate. The era was not one monolithic block of cruelty, but a patchwork of experiences. Still, the cultural expectation leaned heavily toward restraint, order, and obedience, often enforced with a firm hand. As you turn the corner, a sharp wind carries the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart, mingled with the sour tang of horse manure. A man tips his hat politely as he passes you, but you notice the small boy trailing behind him, carrying a heavy sack that nearly drags on the ground. That's the way of things here. Even children are miniature adults, expected to shoulder burdens that feel too heavy for their tiny frames. The Victorians adored rules, not just in their homes but in society at large. There were rules about how to dress for dinner, how to address your betters, even how many inches your skirt should be from the ground. Manuals circulated, instructing mothers on the correct way to raise morally upright children. These guides often recommended harsh discipline, limited affection, and plenty of Bible verses to keep little ones on the straight and narrow. Some books even advised against rocking a baby to sleep, lest it become too attached or spoiled. Yes, apparently lullabies were considered dangerous, so much for gentle parenting. And yet, hidden among the stern rules, you stumble across stories of children who found ways to rebel. They might sneak a sweet from a cupboard, or whisper jokes in church, or steal an extra half hour of play in the garden before being caught. Even in the strictest households, childhood has a way of slipping through the cracks. As you walk past the fog-draped houses, you notice how quiet it is, so different from the noise of a modern home, where televisions hum, phones buzz, and laughter spills into every corner. Here, silence is safety, and silence is obedience. Your footsteps echo once more, carrying you deeper into this world where appearances are everything. Discipline is a virtue, and children's lives are shaped by rules so strict they barely leave room to breathe. You sense there is more to uncover, more layers of control, fear, and small rebellions. And so you keep walking, ready to peer behind the next curtain, the next door, the next story. You follow the family a little longer, their boots tapping out a steady rhythm on the cobblestones until they slip into their narrow townhouse. The door shuts with a soft thud, and you pause outside for a moment, as if your ears might still catch the muffled cadence of a father's voice or the clatter of cutlery being carefully aligned. In this world, the perfect family is less about affection and more about appearances. You're stepping into a society where morality is paraded like fine china in a cabinet, something polished, fragile, and sometimes never actually used for eating. Victorian England, stretching from 1837 to 1901 under Queen Victoria, prided itself on stability and virtue. At least, that's the story polite society liked to tell itself. The father was cast as the stern patriarch, the provider and unquestioned head of household. The mother was the moral compass, tasked with molding children into God-fearing citizens who never strayed from duty. Children, of course, were the raw clay, expected to be molded, shaped, and hardened into obedient adults who would one day carry the empire's weight on their own small shoulders. You, wandering invisibly among them, notice how much energy goes into keeping this image intact. A single misbehaved child could taint the entire family's reputation, and reputation was currency. It's not that love didn't exist. Many parents adored their children. Queen Victoria herself doted on her husband, Prince Albert, and their 9 children, even as she demanded strict discipline. Still, affection was often hidden behind closed doors like contraband. To lavish a child with kisses in public, unthinkable. A quick squeeze of the hand under the table might be the closest thing to tenderness you'd see outside the nursery. Historians still debate whether this was genuine emotional restraint or just the performance of restraint, a kind of moral theatre everyone felt obligated to act out. You wander farther, passing a toy shop window where miniature rocking horses and dollhouses sit in perfect rows. They look cheerful enough, but you realize many of the children walking by are not allowed to play with them. Toys were often reserved for wealthier families, and even then they were chosen for their educational value. A puzzle that taught patience, a doll that reinforced gender roles, or a set of toy soldiers that quietly prepared young boys for a future in the military. Play was tolerated only if it served a purpose. Laughter was acceptable if it was polite, but not too loud. And heaven forbid a child invent a game that was rowdy or uncouth. One quirky thing you notice is how obsessed Victorian parents were with physical posture. Straight backs, tucked chins, shoulders down. It was practically a national sport. There are even surviving accounts of children being made to wear backboards or posture braces, devices that looked more like medieval torture instruments than health aids. Some schools forced children to sit with sticks strapped behind their shoulders to prevent slouching. Imagine trying to sneak a yawn at the dinner table, only to feel a piece of wood dig into your shoulder blades. Talk about losing your appetite. You walk past a parlor where a boy no older than 6 is standing in the corner facing the wall. He's not allowed to join the family's conversation because he forgot to say please when asking for bread. Discipline, you realize, wasn't just about punishment, it was about public shaming. A child's errors became a kind of moral theatre for the rest of the family to witness. It's a cruel way of teaching, yet to many Victorians it felt necessary. They lived in an era obsessed with control of empire, of industry, of morality. Children were expected to be miniature citizens, arraying themselves with the dignity of adults long before they were ready. Still, as you continue walking through the dim streets, you catch a softer moment. Through another window, you see a mother reading aloud by the fire, her voice lilting as she recites lines from Tennyson or a Grimm's fairy tale. The children lean close, eyes wide, perhaps frightened by dark forests and wicked stepmothers, but comforted by her presence. Here, at least, warmth seeps through the rigid structure, and maybe that's the paradox of the Victorian family. Beneath all the rules there was love, but it was filtered through a lens of duty, discipline, and fear that often left children unsure whether they were cherished or merely trained. If you glance upward, you'll see laundry lines stretched across the alley, stockings swaying like ghostly flags in the mist. Each sock has been scrubbed, wrung out, and pinned by hand, usually by a young girl of 12 or 13. She spends her days boiling water in heavy pots, rubbing cloth against a washboard until her knuckles are raw. The family's spotless tablecloths and neatly ironed shirts don't appear by magic. They are the work of small, tired hands. And while her labour proves to the neighbours that the family is respectable, it also quietly robs her of a childhood. You pause for a moment under a gas lamp, watching the flame waver as a carriage passes. In its flicker, you think you see the outline of a child's face at a window, eyes wide and solemn, peering out at the city. Was she dreaming of freedom? Was she longing to run down the street and join the boys with their hoops? Historians still argue whether Victorian children were truly as repressed and joyless as many accounts suggest, or whether the era's strict codes coexisted with hidden laughter and affection. Either way, the children you glimpse tonight seem caught between two worlds. The world of play they long for, and the world of adult expectations pressing down on them before they can even spell their own names. The fog thickens around you as you move on, softening the gaslight until it looks like the city is holding its breath. You can almost hear the collective murmur of Victorian parents reminding their children to sit up straighter, to speak less, to work harder, to pray more. And you, drifting quietly through the shadows, are left to wonder, what kind of childhood could truly grow in soil that allowed so little room for joy? The mist clings to your coat as you wander deeper into the heart of Victorian life, and soon you find yourself standing at the threshold of another home. Inside, the warm glow of a fire flickers over walls adorned with heavy wallpaper patterned in deep reds and golds. The family here is gathered in their sitting room, and you can almost feel the tension in the air as children perch stiffly on the edge of their chairs, their hands folded neatly in their laps. You realize you've walked into a world ruled by rules, an invisible cage built not of iron bars but of expectations, instructions, and don'ts. Everywhere you look, Victorian children are bound by strict guidelines. They are told how to sit, how to walk, how to hold their teacups without making a sound. They must bow at the right angle, curtsy at the right time, and always speak when spoken to, but never too much. The adults in their lives see childhood not as a time of discovery and play, but as a training ground for future adulthood. You notice how often you hear the word discipline whispered in drawing rooms and scrawled across the pages of advice manuals. To be a good child is to be quiet, obedient, and perfectly controlled. And if that sounds a little exhausting, it's because it was. Historians still argue whether this strictness was rooted in genuine concern for children's futures or in the anxieties of a society undergoing massive upheaval. The Industrial Revolution had transformed everything: work, family life, and social class. The world felt unstable, and many Victorian parents clung to rules as a lifeline, believing that if their children were properly moulded, they would survive whatever storms came. Order at the dinner table, order in the nursery, order in every aspect of life. It was as if they thought iron discipline could hold back the chaos of change. But not every parent enforced these rules was. With kindness, you catch a glimpse of a boy being made to stand silently in the corner because he fidgeted too much while reciting his Latin. His small shoulders shake as he fights back tears, but his mother does not comfort him. She simply reminds him, in a stern voice, that to fidget is to show weakness. Imagine being 6 years old and told that tapping your foot is a sign of moral decay. You'd never survive a Victorian classroom, especially if you're the kind of person who chews pens or doodles in the margins of notebooks. Of course, there were softer households too. In some homes, especially outside the rigid upper classes, children were allowed a little more freedom. You pass by a cottage where you hear laughter spilling out of an open window. Inside, a mother is kneeling on the rug, playing marbles with her children while a kettle whistles on the stove. The rules here seem less suffocating, and you realize that even in an age obsessed with appearances, there were still pockets of warmth and joy. Some fathers played music with their children in the evenings, or told tall tales about their youth. There are even accounts of Victorian families who delighted in encouraging their children's curiosity, allowing them to collect bugs, sketch plants, or read fantastical novels under the covers with a candle stub. Still, the general expectation remained firm. Children were to be moulded, not indulged. One quirky belief you stumble upon was the obsession with character training through cold water baths. Many parents insisted that their children bathe in icy water, not for hygiene, though let's be honest, it probably helped with the coal dust, but because it was thought to strengthen the willpower. You imagine yourself being dragged out of bed before dawn, plunged into a basin of freezing water and told this is for your own good. If you managed not to scream, congratulations, you were building moral fibre. If you did scream, well, back to the drawing board. You wander farther down the street and spot a notice in a shop window advertising child discipline aids. It lists things like birch rods, leather straps, and even a peculiar contraption designed to keep a child from sucking their thumb. The Victorians had a knack for turning every small habit into a moral failing, and every failing into a problem that needed correction. Yet, as you pause at the window, you catch sight of something else, an advertisement for a family photography studio. Families could now have their portraits taken together, frozen forever in a stiff but elegant pose. For many, this was their chance to prove to neighbours and future generations that they had achieved that ideal of a perfect family. It didn't matter if the children were terrified or miserable behind their forced smiles. The photograph would show only composure and unity. As you stand there, listening to the clip-clop of horses and the faint strains of a street violinist nearby, you wonder what it must have felt like to grow up under such constant scrutiny. Even playtime wasn't safe. If you were a boy, your games were supposed to train you for empire, building forts out of blocks, staging battles with tin soldiers, learning to march in line. If you were a girl, your play was practice for motherhood, dressing dolls, pouring tea and sewing tiny dresses. Childhood wasn't about discovery, it was rehearsal for adulthood. And yet, here comes another contradiction. There were voices even then calling for change. Writers like Charles Dickens exposed the harsh realities of child labour and neglect, painting heartbreaking pictures of orphans and workhouse waifs. Social reformers argued that children needed not just discipline, but also compassion, education, and care. Historians still debate whether these voices truly shifted Victorian parenting or whether they simply provided a convenient outlet for or guilt while the majority of children continued to live under strict, sometimes cruel, regimes. You take another breath of the smoky night air. Somewhere, church bells begin to toll, and the sound reverberates like a lullaby. The streets feel older here, more secretive, as if they've seen more than they care to reveal. You trail your hand along the damp brick, thinking of all the small hands that once did the same, pressed against walls as they were told to stand still, silent and unseen. And as you move forward, you can't help but wonder, if perfection was the goal of the Victorian family, what price did the children pay for being moulded into symbols rather than nurtured as individuals? That is the weight you carry with you now, stepping deeper into this shadowed world where rules reign supreme and laughter is a luxury rationed out like sugar in tea. The fog drifts lower as you leave the glow of the parlour behind, and the sound of your footsteps feels louder than ever. You're walking straight into a realm where silence was golden and noise was punished, and the evidence of that truth is everywhere. You catch the faint creak of a door opening, and curious, you peer inside another home. Here you see a boy no older than 8 standing in the middle of a study. His father, tall and stiff as a chimney stack, paces slowly in front of him. The boy's small hands are clasped tight behind his back. He doesn't dare move. He doesn't dare breathe too loudly. Discipline in Victorian households was rarely a gentle reminder. More often it was a performance of authority. The philosophy of the time was steeped in proverbs. Spare the rod, spoil the child. To many parents, love was shown not through affection but through correction. A disobedient child wasn't just testing boundaries, they were risking their moral soul. So punishment wasn't merely about teaching, it was about saving. Unfortunately, saving often came with the sting of a switch, the buckle of a belt, or the shame of being locked in a dark cupboard until obedience bloomed. Historians still argue whether this obsession with punishment actually created discipline or simply fear. Some claim it instilled a stoic resilience that allowed Victorians to build an empire. Others believe it left scars that carried into adulthood, producing generations of adults who struggled to express affection. And if you're sitting there thinking, I get anxious just from my phone buzzing, I'd probably faint if someone pulled out a cane, well, that's exactly the point. You probably wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes at a Victorian breakfast table. Take, for instance, the common practice of corporal punishment at school. Teachers wielded canes like conductors' batons, ready to strike at the faintest misstep, talking out of turn, misspelling a word, even left-handedness. Yes, they considered that suspicious, could earn a smack across the knuckles. Some teachers kept a collection of canes in the classroom, each one with its own name and reputation. Imagine trying to focus on your multiplication tables while Old Stinger leans menacingly in the corner like some Victorian version of a lightsaber. But the strictness didn't stop at the school gates. At home, parents had their own arsenal of punishments. Being sent to bed without supper was common, though in a time when meals were often meagre to begin with, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a real hardship. Some children were forced to wear signs announcing their misdeeds, like liar or thief, turning their mistakes into public shame. You can almost see a small girl standing on a stool in the parlour, a crude cardboard placard hanging around her neck, while visitors glance at her with disapproval. The lesson wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about humiliation, a reminder that even the smallest slip could stain the family's honour. And then there were the stranger, almost absurd punishments. One anecdote tells of a boy forced to wear a dunce cap so tall it scraped the ceiling, while his classmates giggled behind their hymn books. Another story tells of parents making their son sit on a chair with a piece of soap in his mouth until he promised never to speak rudely again. You almost want to whisper to that poor boy, "You know, in the future people will pay good money for fancy soap that smells like lavender and vanilla. You might even like it. But for him, the taste is only bitterness." You shuffle onward, and outside another home you hear the muffled sounds of weeping. A girl with tangled hair has been locked in the coal cellar as punishment for sneaking sweets. You feel the cold draft rising from the cracks of the cellar door, and you can imagine the suffocating dark she must be enduring, alone with the scuttling of rats. For her parents, this is tough love. For her, it is terror. Of course, it wasn't all bleakness. In some families, discipline meant stern lectures or extra chores rather than physical punishment. You stumble upon one father, spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, wagging a finger as he lectures his son about honesty. The boy fidgets, but the punishment is merely to copy lines from the Bible until his hand aches. Compared to a whipping, that might almost feel like a blessing. And some parents, influenced by progressive thinkers like Charles Dickens or educational reformers such as Friedrich Froebel, began to question whether constant punishment really raised better children or merely silenced them. As you walk, you begin to notice the psychological weight of this world. Children walk with their heads bowed, eyes darting nervously toward their parents. Joy seems to flicker only when no adult is watching. And you can't help but think of how different childhood feels in your own world, where children might argue, laugh too loud, or sprawl across the dinner table with ketchup on their faces. In Victorian London, ketchup might not even exist in most homes, and if it did, you'd better not spill a drop on the white linen. That could mean a scolding that echoes louder than the church bells. There's a sense, too, that the strictness of Victorian parenting didn't stop at behaviour, it extended into thought. Religious instruction was woven into daily life, with children memorising catechisms and Bible verses before they could even read fairy tales. A child who dared question scripture or show scepticism risked being labelled rebellious. Historians still debate whether this environment encouraged a kind of intellectual discipline or simply stifled curiosity. Either way, as you continue your quiet walk through the gaslit streets, you can feel the weight of expectation pressing down on every child, like a heavy hand on their seas. Holder. Up ahead, a boy carries a stack of books taller than his head, shuffling carefully so as not to drop them. He's on his way to his tutor, who will drill him in Latin declensions and moral philosophy long after dark. Education here is not about exploring ideas, it's about discipline, duty, and preparing for a very narrow life path. And if he dares to let his mind wander, the cane is waiting. It's a sobering thought. In an age that gave us railways, photography, and even the first telegraphs, the people who built the modern world were raised in homes where laughter was suspicious, play was limited, and discipline ruled like a monarch on a throne. As you slip back into the fog, leaving the boy and his mountain of books behind, you realize this journey is only beginning. There are darker lessons still ahead, lessons carved not into paper, but into the very lives of children whose childhoods were spent under the shadow of the rod. The farther you wander, the more the sound of the city presses in, horses snorting in the cold, the distant hiss of steam escaping pipes, and the shuffle of countless boots along the stones. You come to a narrow passageway where the smell of coal smoke is replaced by the faint tang of boiled cabbage. A heavy wooden door creaks open and a small boy stumbles out, clutching a cracked slate and a battered primer. His eyes dart nervously, as though the weight of his parents' expectations follows him even into the street. You sense it too, that invisible chain linking every Victorian child to a set of rules that grow heavier the longer you look. Inside, the family continues their evening ritual. After the silent dinner, the children line up in the parlour like little soldiers. Their father stands at the hearth, lecturing about honesty, thrift, and duty to queen and country. Each child must recite a passage from scripture or poetry. One by one they stammer through verses of Milton or lines from the Bible, their voices trembling like the flickering candles that cast tall, nervous shadows against the wallpaper. And when a younger daughter forgets her line, her mother doesn't rush to comfort her. Instead, she frowns and makes a note in a small leather-bound journal, the family's record of behaviour. For many households, such journals were common. Parents believed keeping daily accounts of their children's conduct would help them track progress and identify moral failings. These discipline diaries, as you might call them, listed every slip of the tongue, every fidget, every forgotten chore. Imagine if every time you forgot to wash a dish, someone wrote it down in an official-looking book to read aloud later like a grocery list of sins, not exactly a recipe for sweet dreams. The idea behind these endless rules was rooted in a fear of spoiling children. Victorians worried that affection would soften young people, making them weak, selfish, or even corrupt. A mother who kissed her child too much was accused of encouraging pride. Fathers who allowed their children to play too freely were said to be raising layabouts instead of industrious citizens. Love had to be measured out carefully, like sugar rationed in tea, lest the child grow greedy for it. Historians still debate whether this suspicion of affection was truly universal, or whether it reflected the anxieties of middle and upper-class parents in particular. Many working-class families, after all, relied on children not just for companionship but also for survival. Their sons and daughters were often contributing wages to the household by the time they could carry a bucket or sell matches in the street. Was the coldness of middle-class homes a cultural performance, while working-class children found affection even amid hardship? Or did poverty only intensify the harshness of discipline? The records, like the fog, leave much in shadow. Through a crack in the curtains of another home, you see a peculiar sight. A little girl stands with her arms stretched wide, balancing a book on her head. Her mother watches sternly, timing her with a pocket watch. The exercise is meant to ensure she grows up with perfect posture, a symbol of grace and self-control. If the book falls, the punishment might be a scolding or perhaps something sharper. You can't help but think of how many children today are told simply to sit up straight, and how mercifully fleeting that advice usually is. Then, further along, you stumble across an odd invention advertised on a handbill. A child corrector device, essentially a strap meant to bind a child's hands so they couldn't fidget at the table. One pamphlet claims it will cure the stubbornness of youth within a fortnight. Reading it, you feel an uneasy chuckle rise in your throat. Imagine selling that at a modern parenting store, sandwiched between the eco-friendly diapers and pastel-colored teething rings. Not exactly a bestseller on Amazon, but amid all this severity, there were moments of tenderness, small and fleeting but present. You pause at the edge of a nursery and hear the faint strains of a lullaby. A nanny rocks a cradle, her voice soft and soothing, singing about stars and angels while the baby's eyelids flutter shut. The mother watches from the doorway, arms crossed, as if torn between disapproval of such softness and a longing to be the one holding her child. Love existed here, but it was complicated, tangled in expectations about propriety and duty. It strikes you how much these rules were less about children themselves and more about what parents wanted the world to think. To have a well-behaved child was to announce to neighbors that you were respectable, godly, and in control. And if your child misbehaved, the shame fell not on the child but on you. Discipline in this sense was less about the child's growth and more about protecting the family's public image. The child became a mirror, polished daily until it reflected back the parent's desired reputation. Yet even in the strictest homes, cracks appeared. You hear a muffled giggle from upstairs, the sound of two siblings whispering under the covers after lights out. They're inventing stories, trading jokes, and perhaps sneaking bites of contraband sweets hidden under their pillows. These secret moments of rebellion were a way of claiming some piece of joy, however small, in a world that often seemed designed to stamp it out. You can almost see them stifling their laughter, ears straining for the sound of their father's boots on the stairs. Childhood here is a careful balancing act between fear and freedom, obedience and mischief. You pause beneath another street lamp and watch your breath mingle with the fog. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock chimes the hour, and you realize how every moment of a Victorian child's day was equally regimented. Wake at dawn, chores before breakfast, lessons in the morning, more lessons in the afternoon, prayers before bed. The day was carved into neat slices of discipline, as though spontaneity itself were something dangerous, something to be tamed. It makes you wonder, what would happen if one of these children were suddenly transported to your world, plopped down in front of a television, handed a bag of potato chips, and told they could play outside until the street lights came on? Would they leap with joy, or would they sit stiffly on the couch, hands folded, waiting for someone to tell them what to do? As you drift farther down the narrow street, you notice that even the architecture seems to echo the rules of Victorian parenting. The houses are tall, symmetrical, their windows evenly spaced like soldiers in formation. Nothing is out of place. Every flower box is tidy, every step scrubbed clean. The world you're wandering through is orderly, yes, but it is also cold. And for the children growing up inside these brick walls, that order was both a shield and a prison. The fog swirls again, curling around your ankles as you move on. You feel the weight of all those unspoken rules pressing in, a constant reminder that in Victorian families, perfection was demanded, mistakes were punished, and affection was rationed like contraband. You walk quietly, almost holding your breath, as though you too might be scolded for disturbing the silence. And just ahead, you sense a new sound waiting for you. Not the clipped tones of parental lectures this time, but something sharper, more jarring. A crack, a snap, a child's startled gasp. It's the sound of discipline carried out not with words, but with wood and leather. You steel yourself because you're about to step into a room where the rod is more familiar than the embrace. The sound reaches you before the sight does, a sharp snap that cuts through the fog like a whip through silence. You pause, heart thudding, and the noise comes again. You follow it, your steps cautious now, until you find yourself at the side of a tall townhouse with narrow windows and iron railings. Through a thin crack in the shutters you glimpse a figure, a boy no more than 10, bent over a wooden chair. His father stands behind him, cane in hand, face set like stone. Discipline in Victorian homes was not a matter of quiet disappointment or a gentle time-out. It was often something physical, direct, and painfully memorable. Parents and teachers and even employers truly believed that striking a child could drive out folly and prevent future sins. A sting across the knuckles with a ruler, a strap across the back, or the dreaded birch rod were all considered normal. The words "spare the rod and spoil the child" echoed through drawing rooms and classrooms alike. And as you watch, you can almost hear the father thinking that every welt was a mark of moral instruction. Historians still argue whether Victorians were truly more brutal than earlier generations, or if we simply have more written records of their methods. After all, punishments like whipping children were common in earlier centuries too, but in the Victorian era, punishment became almost industrialized. Schools openly displayed their canes. Workhouses had entire rooms designed for correction. Even advice manuals for mothers gave detailed instructions for when and how to use physical punishment. It wasn't a matter of whether to punish, but how best to do it without tipping over into cruelty, though to be honest, their definition of cruelty was probably very different from yours. Of course, not all punishments involved bruises. Shame was one of the most powerful tools in a Victorian parent's arsenal. You might see a child forced to stand in the corner with their nose pressed against the wall for hours, or worse, made to wear a dunce cap in school, a tall pointed hat that transformed them into the class fool. The humiliation lingered long after the hat was taken off. Imagine showing up to your Zoom call tomorrow with a giant cardboard cone taped to your head because you missed a deadline. That's the kind of public spectacle Victorian children endured for spilling ink or forgetting a verse. But sometimes the methods veered into the truly bizarre. In one household, a boy who bit his nails was forced to wear metal finger cages at all hours of the day. In another, a girl who spoke too much was made to sit silently with a cloth tied across her mouth. Parents devised contraptions that would make modern child psychologists wince. Posture chairs with rigid backs, straps to keep hands still during lessons, even harnesses that forced children to walk with exaggerated poise. The Victorians weren't just raising children, they were sculpting statues, as though humanity could be carved into perfection through discomfort. You pass by a schoolyard at dusk, its high stone walls casting long shadows. Inside, the day's lessons are done, but you can still hear the echoes of what came before, the sharp crack of a cane, the murmured recitation of Latin verbs, the shuffle of weary feet. A teacher stands with a pointer in hand, tapping it against the desk for emphasis as he lectures about obedience, respect, and the dangers of idleness. For him, teaching is not about curiosity, it's about control. The classroom is a factory of discipline, producing children who will someday take their place in the vast machinery of empire. Still, even here you notice a flicker of resistance. A boy in the back row whispers a joke to his neighbor, stifling a laugh behind his hand. Another girl doodles flowers in the margin of her arithmetic book. It's a small rebellion, but in a world so tightly bound by rules it feels daring. Historians still argue whether these tiny acts of defiance were signs of a youthful spirit that couldn't be crushed, or whether they were desperate attempts to carve out even the smallest space for individuality. Either way, you can't help but smile at the bravery of a child who dares to draw a silly face in the corner of her copybook while the teacher drones on about Roman history. As you continue walking, you notice that even the streets themselves enforce discipline. Policemen patrol corners with stiff backs and stern faces, keeping a close eye on ragged children who linger too long by shop windows. The law did not view children as innocents to be protected, but as potential criminals in the making. The phrase "the criminal classes" was often applied not to hardened adults but to children as young as 6 caught stealing bread or coal. Many of these children weren't delinquents at all, they were simply hungry. Yet they might find themselves sentenced to hard labor in a reformatory where the regime of discipline was even harsher than at home. And then there's the darker side of punishment, the factories. You hear the steady clank of gears and the hiss of steam, the sound of machinery that never sleeps. Inside, children as young as 5 or 6 crawl beneath massive looms to untangle threads, their tiny fingers nimble enough to reach where adults cannot. The work is dangerous, so dangerous that many children were maimed or killed when machines whirred back to life unexpectedly. When accidents happened, sympathy was rare. Employers often blamed the child for being careless, and parents, desperate for wages, sent their children back to work as soon as they were able to walk again. It's hard not to shiver as you imagine yourself in their place. Would you, at the age of 8, have had the courage to crawl under a machine taller than a house, knowing one wrong move could cost you a hand? Probably not. Honestly, some of us can barely manage changing a printer cartridge without injury. And yet, through the soot and the strictness, you also see the paradox of Victorian discipline. In some cases, the structure provided stability in a rapidly changing world. Children who might otherwise have fallen through society's cracks found direction, education, and purpose. Some grew up to lead armies, write novels, or even shape governments. Discipline, in the Victorian imagination, was not about cruelty for its own sake, but about building character. Whether it succeeded is another matter. You take a deep breath, the coal-thick air heavy in your chest. Around you, the city quiets as the night deepens. The sharp crack of canes fades, replaced by the softer sounds of lullabies, whispered prayers, and the restless rustling of children in their beds. You realize that for every harsh punishment, there may also have been moments of kindness, fleeting, hidden, but real. And it is in that tension between love and fear that Victorian childhood was lived. You walk on, the fog curling tighter, and ahead you hear the faint creak of a carriage door. This time the sound is not of discipline, but of departure, of children being sent away from home, packed off with small trunks and tearful goodbyes. It seems that rules and punishment were not enough for Victorian parents. They believed something else was necessary: distance. And as you drift closer, you realize you are about to step into the cold halls of the infamous boarding schools. The fog lifts slightly as you approach the outskirts of the city, and with it comes a new sound: the squeak of wagon wheels on gravel, the snort of tired horses, and the muffled sobs of children clutching small trunks against their chests. You follow the sound until you see a line of families gathered near a set of iron gates. Beyond those gates rise the stern walls of a Victorian boarding school, a place parents believed would turn their offspring into disciplined young ladies and gentlemen. The children glance back over their shoulders one last time before stepping through the gates, their faces pale with uncertainty, and you, standing invisibly among them, feel a twinge of unease. Boarding schools in the Victorian era were considered a mark of status, proof that a family had enough wealth to send their sons and daughters away to be molded by professionals. For the upper and middle classes, it was almost expected. A boy who remained at home too long might be considered spoiled, and a girl who wasn't placed under the watchful eye of a governess or headmistress might be thought ill-prepared for her eventual role as wife and mother. But while parents believed they were providing the best opportunities, the reality was often far harsher. The dormitories you step into are cold and severe. Rows of iron-framed beds line the walls, each one topped with a thin, itchy wool blanket. There are no posters of favorite bands or stuffed animals tucked under pillows here. Those are indulgences for another century. Instead, the only decoration is a crucifix on the wall and perhaps a stern motto stitched into fabric. Idleness is the root of all evil. You imagine trying to fall asleep under the watchful eyes of saints and stern proverbs, your stomach rumbling from the watery porridge served at dinner. Discipline follows the children even into their dreams. The school day begins before dawn with the clang of a bell that yanks them from bed like a drill sergeant's whistle. They line up in their uniforms, scrubbed and silent, and march into classrooms where the windows barely let in light through the soot-streaked glass. A teacher stands at the front, chalk in hand, eyes sharp as a hawk's. The lessons are not about creativity or self-expression. Instead, they are about memorization, reciting Latin verbs, copying moral maxims, and drilling arithmetic until the numbers blur together. You picture yourself sitting at one of those desks trying to remember whether amo, amas, amat means I love, or I might fall asleep right here. The cruelty here wasn't always physical. Often it was simply the absence of warmth. Children were rarely hugged or comforted. Letters home were censored, with teachers reading them before they were sealed. A child who dared to complain about hunger or homesickness might have their letter torn up, or worse, sent back with a sarcastic note to their parents. Historians still argue whether this detachment was meant to toughen children for adult life, or whether it was simply a convenient way for parents to outsource the unpleasant parts of parenting. Some argue that wealthy families genuinely believed distance made the heart grow fonder, while others see it as an excuse for neglect disguised as virtue. And then there were the punishments. You watch as a young boy, no older than 12, stumbles over a line of Shakespeare. The teacher's cane flashes down, striking his palms until they glow red. Another child is ordered to wear a wooden board hung from his neck, painted with the word dunce in bold black letters. It's not just punishment, it's a performance, a public shaming that reinforces the lesson for everyone else in the room. And while the boy lowers his head, you can see his lips moving silently, perhaps muttering the word he was meant to memorize. Sometimes the punishments became almost theatrical. A child caught whispering after lights out might be forced to march around the dormitory with a heavy log on their shoulders, stumbling in the dark while their classmates watched. Another might be made to stand in the courtyard for hours, rain soaking through their thin jacket, until they were too cold to shiver. You think about modern school detentions, writing lines on a chalkboard, maybe missing recess, and realize just how different the Victorian idea of discipline truly was. A missed homework assignment today might earn you a stern talk. In 1850, it might earn you a welt on your knuckles that lasted for days. One quirky detail you stumble upon is the Victorian fascination with character-building diets. Some schools believed that feeding children plain, bland food would discourage sinful appetites. Puddings were stripped of sugar, meat was boiled until flavorless, and treats were considered dangerous luxuries. In one account, a boy was caught sneaking jam from the pantry and was punished not just with a caning, but by being forced to eat the jam until he was sick. Imagine trying to sneak cookies from the kitchen only to be told, "Oh, you like cookies? Fine, eat the whole jar." Sounds like a dream until you realize the jam is mostly sugar and vinegar, and you're expected to lick the jar clean. Yet, amid this bleakness, there are still glimpses of humanity. In a quiet corner of the school, you find a group of children huddled together around a single candle, whispering stories they've invented. One girl describes a dragon with emerald green scales that lives beneath the Thames. Another boy imagines an explorer who sails to the ends of the earth and finds lands where children can play all day without being scolded. For a moment, the cold walls fall away, replaced by castles in the clouds and jungles full of adventure. In their whispered tales, the children create a world where discipline cannot follow them, where parents and teachers have no power, and where laughter is not a crime. You pause, listening to the quiet rhythm of their voices, and realize that this secret storytelling is its own act of rebellion. The Victorians may have tried to control childhood, to shape it into something rigid and respectable, but imagination slipped through the cracks like candlelight through a shutter, and even if those children would rise early tomorrow to another day of punishment and lectures, tonight, in their whispered fantasies, they are free. The candle gutters, the flame flickering as if it too is exhausted from the weight of the day. You step back into the fog, letting the heavy school doors close behind you. The streets are quieter now, the city settling into its nocturnal rhythm, but your journey is far from over. Ahead you hear the scrape of tiny shoes on cobblestones, the shuffle of feet carrying buckets and bundles. Not all children were sent to schools like this. For many, the Victorian dream of discipline took a harsher form, not in classrooms, but in endless work. And as you follow the sound of those weary footsteps, you realize you are about to step into the world of childhood labor, where play is a luxury and survival is the only rule. The fog seems to thicken again as you drift down narrower alleys where the light of the gas lamps barely reaches the slick stones beneath your feet. Here, the grandeur of the polished townhouses has given way to rows of cramped, crumbling tenements, each building leaning slightly toward its neighbor as though they're conspiring to collapse together. From behind the cracked shutters and broken panes you hear muffled coughs, the squeak of a crying baby and the faint clatter of pans. Out here, far from the stiff dinner tables of the middle class, the Victorian rules of child-rearing take on a harsher shape. You spot a cluster of children huddled beneath a crooked archway, their clothes patched and too thin for the chill of the evening. They're not lined up in neat rows like the boarding school pupils you just left. Instead, they dart in and out of the shadows, calling out to passers-by with sing-song voices. One little boy waves a bundle of matches, his fingers trembling from the cold as he begs someone, anyone, to buy a box. His sister, no older than 6, clutches a tray of cheap flowers, her hair tangled but her smile practiced. These are the street children of Victorian London, and their parents are nowhere to be seen. For working-class families, the rules of childhood weren't about posture at the dinner table, they were about survival. Children were expected to contribute to the household economy as soon as they could walk and talk. Some sold newspapers, shouting headlines at the top of their lungs in crowded markets. Others shined boots until their knees ached, earning just enough for a crust of bread. And many, heartbreakingly, were sent into factories, mines, or the dark chasms of chimneys. Childhood for them was not a time of innocence but of toil. Historians still argue about whether Victorian parents forced their children into labour out of cruelty or necessity. For many families, wages from child workers meant the difference between eating and starving. In some industries, children were actually preferred because their small bodies could fit into narrow spaces where adults could not. Coal mines, for example, relied on young boys, some as young as 5, to crawl through tunnels and drag carts of coal behind them. You shiver at the thought of crawling through pitch-black passages with only a flickering candle to light the way, the air so thick with coal dust that every breath feels like swallowing ash. Honestly, you'd probably tap out after 5 minutes, and that's before you even considered the rats. And yet, the streets held their own dangers. Without parental supervision, many children were left to fend for themselves entirely. These street Arabs, as they were often called, slept under bridges, begged at railway stations, and sometimes turned to petty theft just to survive. In the popular imagination, they were considered troublesome little criminals waiting to grow into bigger ones. But if you stand with them for just a moment longer, you see the truth. Hungry eyes watching bakery windows, bare feet bleeding from walking miles, hands rubbed raw from scrubbing boots for pennies. Their crimes were usually nothing more than desperation disguised as mischief. A quirky detail catches your attention, a boy not much taller than a broomstick balancing on a crate to shout about the latest scandal sheets. His voice cracks mid-sentence, squeaking so high it startles even him. The crowd laughs, and he laughs too, his face turning red, though whether from embarrassment or the chill air you can't be sure. It's a fleeting glimpse of the child inside the labourer, and it reminds you that no amount of discipline could fully erase the spark of youth. You turn down another lane and find a group of young girls working in a dimly lit room. They're bent over sewing machines, stitching until their fingers are blistered. The overseer paces the rows, his cane tapping the floor rhythmically. Every mistake, a crooked stitch, a dropped thread, could mean lost wages or worse. The girls are silent, heads bowed, the only sound the steady hum of the machines. And yet, you notice one girl has embroidered a tiny flower into the hem of the fabric she's working on. It's a secret rebellion, a small act of beauty hidden in the folds of monotony. The workhouse is darker still. You pass through its heavy doors, the air thick with the smell of damp straw, unwashed bodies and thin porridge. Children here are not merely labourers, they are inmates. Many were orphans, others the children of parents too poor or too desperate to care for them. In the workhouse, discipline was absolute. Meals were meagre, beds were hard, and any sign of disobedience was met with swift punishment. Some children spent their days picking apart old ropes for fibres until their fingers bled. Others were sent to scrub endless stone floors or break stones for gravel. Historians still debate the true intentions behind the workhouse system. Some argue that it was meant as a deterrent, a way to discourage laziness by making poverty as unpleasant as possible. Others suggest it was simply the cheapest way to manage the poor, disguising neglect as moral instruction. Whatever the intent, the children within its walls lived lives defined by labour and scarcity. As you drift among them, you notice their eyes, too old for their years, too tired for games. Yet even here, small sparks of childhood persist. One boy has carved a tiny horse out of a scrap of coal, the black figure clutched tightly in his hand. Another girl has hidden a marble in her pocket, rolling it secretly in her fingers during work. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Children sewing endless shirts for strangers, but still sneaking moments of play with a single marble. It's as if their spirit is determined to survive, no matter how heavy the hand of discipline presses down. And then there's the sound. Outside, the city is alive with carriages, bells, and voices. But inside the workhouse, it's the sound of coughing, the scrape of spoons against tin bowls, and the low hum of children singing hymns as they work. The songs are solemn, full of words about obedience, humility, and sin. They sing not because they want to, but because they are told it will keep their hearts pure. You can almost hear the echo of your own childhood music, a favourite cartoon theme song maybe, and the contrast is jarring. Imagine if your lullabies were less about twinkling stars and more about eternal damnation, sweet dreams indeed. As the night deepens, you step back into the mist. The children remain at their posts, their small bodies bent over endless work, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light like lanterns that refuse to be extinguished. The streets ahead stretch on, and you sense that the story is only growing heavier, for beyond the factories and the workhouses lies another chapter of childhood discipline. One that doesn't end at home or at school, but follows the children into every corner of their lives. And just as you turn the corner, you hear the distant cries of a child calling out for a mother who will not come. The sound clings to you like the soot in the air, and you realize you've stepped into a part of history where cruelty wasn't the exception, it was the expectation. The cries guide your steps until you find yourself at the edge of a massive brick structure, its chimneys coughing out plumes of smoke that mingle with the ever-present London fog. A heavy iron gate swings open and a group of children shuffle inside. Their clothes are worn thin, their cheeks smudged with soot, even before they've begun the day's work. You follow quietly, slipping into the echoing cavern of a textile mill. The noise is immediate and overwhelming. Deafening clatters of iron gears, the shriek of steam escaping valves, and the endless thrum of machines that never seem to sleep. The air is thick with lint and dust, so heavy that you instinctively cover your mouth, though of course as a silent observer you don't need to. The children here, though, are not so fortunate. They breathe it in hour after hour, their lungs filling with fibres that will scratch and scar them from the inside. Some cough until their small bodies shake. Others simply keep their heads down and push forward. The Victorians saw factories as the heartbeat of progress, the engines of empire, but those machines were fed not only with coal and cotton but with childhoods. Boys as young as 6 were employed as piecers, darting between the moving frames to tie together broken threads. Girls worked at the looms, their tiny fingers nimble enough to handle delicate cloth. Some children served as scavengers, crawling under the machines to collect scraps of cotton, even while the gears were still turning. The pay? A few pennies a week, barely enough for bread and broth. Historians still argue about whether these children were victims of exploitation or participants in their family's survival strategy. To modern ears, the idea of sending a child into a factory feels like cruelty, plain and simple. But in the 1840s, when families often lived one missed payday away from starvation, the extra income from a child's labor could mean life or death. And yet the toll it took on young bodies was undeniable. Reports from factory inspectors detail children with twisted spines, missing fingers, and lungs so damaged they could barely breathe by the age of 20. You watch as a boy squeezes his small frame under a humming loom to collect scraps. The machine rattles above him, metal teeth snapping inches from his head. He moves quickly, used to the rhythm of the clanking pistons, but you can see the tremor in his hands. One slip and the machine will not stop for him. A foreman with a soot-blackened face shouts for the children to hurry, swinging a leather strap against his thigh for emphasis. The boy scrambles out just in time, clutching a handful of lint like it's treasure. And yet, even in this grim environment, moments of humanity shine through. During a rare pause in the machines, the children whisper to one another, swapping riddles and jokes. One little girl pulls a crust of bread from her apron pocket and breaks it in half to share with her brother. The kindness in that small gesture seems to glow brighter than the oil lamps sputtering overhead. You smile faintly, imagining how powerful a simple piece of bread must feel in a place where hunger gnaws like a second heartbeat. The factory day is long, sometimes 14 or 16 hours. Children would wake before dawn, work until the sky turned black again, and collapse onto their hard beds with their clothes still covered in grime. Sundays might offer a small reprieve, though many children were expected to attend church services and then return to chores at home. Free time was almost unheard of, even when laws were passed to limit children's working hours, such as the Factory Acts in the mid-19th century. They were often ignored. Inspectors were few, and factory owners were skilled at finding loopholes. One peculiar practice you overhear is called strapping the looms. When a child made a mistake that cost the factory money, they weren't simply punished physically. Sometimes the fine for their mistake was deducted from their already meager wages, leaving them with nothing at week's end. A boy who accidentally tore a piece of cloth might actually owe the factory more than he had earned. Imagine working 14 hours a day only to end up in debt. You'd think you'd get at least a slice of cake for effort, but no. In Victorian factories, effort was just the baseline, and mistakes were treated as crimes. As the night wears on, the mill begins to empty. Children shuffle out, eyes glazed, their tiny frames bent from the weight of hours of labor. You follow them into the damp night air, where the fog seems to swallow their tired bodies whole. Some head back to their families, clutching their pennies tight. Others drift toward alleys and doorways, where they'll curl up on straw until the next day begins. But just as you think the night can't grow any darker, you catch sight of a narrow chimney rising above the rooftops, smoke trickling from its mouth. At its base, a boy no older than 7 is stripping off his shirt, his ribs showing through his pale skin. A man stands beside him, holding a bundle of brushes tied to a rope. The boy looks up at the chimney with wide eyes. It's narrow, so narrow you can barely imagine squeezing your own shoulders through. Yet the boy takes a deep breath, grasps the rope, and begins to climb inside. Chimney sweeping was one of the most infamous forms of child labour in the Victorian age. Tiny boys, sometimes no more than 5 years old, were forced to shimmy up chimneys, scraping soot from the walls with brushes, or even with their bare hands. It was filthy, dangerous work, and it often left them with raw knees, scarred elbows, and lungs full of black dust. Some children suffocated when they became stuck, others fell to their deaths. But for parents who needed the money and for master sweeps who valued small bodies that could fit into narrow flues, these dangers were dismissed as part of the job. Historians still argue whether society at large turned a blind eye to this cruelty out of genuine ignorance or willful denial. Some claim that the dangers of chimney sweeping weren't widely understood until much later, when doctors began documenting the horrific lung diseases and cancers that plagued former sweeps. Others argue that people knew all along but chose to look away because they needed their fireplaces clean and their homes warm. Whichever the case, the result was the same: thousands of children climbing into choking black chimneys, while adults congratulated themselves on their moral superiority. As you watch the boy disappear into the darkness of the chimney, you feel a shiver run down your spine. The soot clings to his skin, his small body twisting and straining as he inches upward. You can almost hear his cough echoing down the narrow flue, a sound that mixes with the distant toll of church bells. For him, this is not play, it is survival. You step back into the fog, the outline of the chimney fading behind you. The city seems to close in around you, as if reminding you that cruelty was not confined to one house or one school. It was everywhere. In the rules at home, the punishments in classrooms, the endless hours of labor in mills and chimneys. And yet, you've begun to notice something else. Even in the darkest corners, children cling to their small joys, their whispered stories, their stolen moments of play. And as you continue onward, the sound of the boy's coughing fades into the night, replaced by something different: the rhythmic ticking of a clock, the soft rustle of pages turning, and a faint sound of a school bell. You realize you are about to step not into another factory or workhouse, but into a space where children were meant to be shaped in a different way, not through labor, but through lessons. Ahead lies the world of Victorian education, where discipline and duty were woven into every line of chalk on the board. The chimneys fade into the mist behind you, their smoke curling like black ribbons in the night air. Your footsteps take you toward a different sound now, not the relentless pounding of machinery, not the hollow coughs of children, but a sharp rhythmic clatter. You follow it, and soon the fog parts to reveal a looming brick building with tall windows, each one rattling with the vibrations of iron gears inside. The roar grows louder as you draw near, until it becomes a wall of noise that rattles through your chest like thunder. You step through a side door, invisible and untouched, and at once you are swallowed into a world of constant motion. This is the Victorian textile mill, a place that thrived on cotton, steam, and, most disturbingly, child labour. Inside, the air is thick with flying fibres. They stick to your eyelashes and coat your throat with a dusty film. It feels like you've swallowed a pillow. For the children working here, this is not a momentary discomfort, but an everyday reality. Their lungs fill with dust until each breath rasps like sandpaper. You see rows of machines, vast looms clanking with terrifying speed, belts whipping in and out, wooden beams shuddering as if they might splinter at any moment. Small children, some barely 6 years old, dart between the machines, their little bodies perfectly suited to crawl under the clattering frames. They're called scavengers, and their job is to crawl beneath moving machinery to gather scraps of cotton that fall to the floor. It sounds almost playful, like a scavenger hunt, until you realize that if a Hild misjudges the timing, the iron teeth of the loom will clamp down with merciless precision. A boy with soot-smudged cheeks wriggles beneath one of the frames, his shirt catching on a jagged edge. He tugs it free just as the shuttle slams down inches from his head. The foreman, a heavy-set man with a whistle around his neck, shouts something sharp. The boy scrambles back out, clutching a fistful of fluff, and is rewarded with nothing more than a grunt. His pay for the day, perhaps a penny or two, will help buy bread for his family. It seems impossibly small compared to the risk he has just taken. You might think your boss asks a lot when they send you late-night emails, but at least you're not literally dodging machinery with your life on the line. Historians still argue about the true scale of child labour in Victorian factories. Some claim that the worst abuses were limited to certain industries like textiles and coal mining, while others insist that children were essential to nearly every sector of industrial production. Reports from the time describe children falling asleep at their machines, fingers crushed or scalps torn when long hair was caught in gears. Official inquiries eventually led to the Factory Acts, which began to limit working hours for children. The 1833 Factory Act, for example, prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills and restricted older children to a maximum of 9 hours a day. but these rules were often ignored or sidestepped. Factory owners argued that without child labor their businesses would collapse, and parents desperate for wages often lied about their children's ages to keep them employed. There's a strange, almost surreal quirk to life in the mills. To protect the precious cotton threads, windows were often kept closed even in summer to keep the air humid. Workers, children included, sweated through their clothes. These, their skin sticky and raw. Sometimes managers sprinkled water on the floors to keep dust down, but this only turned the room into a damp, slippery trap. You shuffle past a group of girls struggling to lift a heavy basket of cotton, the wet fibers sticking to their arms like snow. One girl giggles as she blows a piece of lint off her nose, earning a sharp glare from the overseer. In a place so consumed by noise and monotony, even a sneeze becomes an act of rebellion. Yet the cruelty wasn't always about physical danger. It was about the hours, the exhaustion, the relentless grind of a childhood spent in service of machines. Imagine yourself at age 7 or 8, trudging into a factory before sunrise, working until your arms ached and your head spun, and then trudging home again, only to sleep for a few hours before doing it all over. You'd probably be begging for a nap after the first day, never mind a lifetime. In one corner of the factory, you spot a boy whose job is to replace broken bobbins. His fingers move so quickly they blur, darting in and out between the moving threads. He looks no older than 10, but he works with the precision of a skilled adult. And yet, when he drops a bobbin, the foreman swoops in, snatches it up, and cuffs him hard across the head. The boy doesn't even cry. He just picks up the next bobbin and keeps going. It's not bravery, you realize. It's resignation. But even here, in this clattering world of smoke and noise, humanity refuses to die. You see two girls who have turned their task of folding cloth into a quiet game. One folds, the other unfolds, and both stifle laughter at their small rebellion. For a brief moment, the mill feels less like a prison and more like a playground, though one lined with sharp edges and deafening noise. As the shift drags on, you notice the children's movements growing slower. Their shoulders droop, their eyes glaze, but the machines keep turning. There are no breaks, no moments of rest. Even when laws later required shorter hours, factory owners often found ways to keep children working longer through loopholes, bribes, or simply by hiding them when inspectors came. And yet, despite it all, the children endured. Some even found pride in their work, boasting about how quickly they could tie a broken thread or climb into the tightest spaces. But you can't help but wonder what might have become of them if they had been allowed to play, to learn, to grow at their own pace. Would some of these boys have been poets? Would some of these girls have been scientists? Historians still debate how much potential was lost in the factories of Victorian England, sacrificed at the altar of progress. As you step back into the fog, leaving behind the clatter of the looms, you hear a different sound. It's softer but no less unsettling, the faint scraping of soot, the muffled cough of a child, and the voice of a man shouting orders. You realize you're not done with the world of work just yet. The factory was brutal, yes, but there is an even darker place where Victorian children toiled, the chimneys, those narrow, suffocating shafts that twisted like blackened intestines through the city's houses. And so you move toward the towering silhouettes of rooftops where smoke curls upward like a warning. Ahead, a small figure is already halfway up a chimney, his bare feet pressed against the sooty bricks, his tiny hands clawing for purchase. You watch, heart heavy, as he disappears into the blackness, leaving only the echo of his cough behind. The coughing of the little sweep fades into the fog as you wander away from the chimneys. The air is still heavy with soot, and every breath feels like swallowing ashes, but now another sound takes its place. The muffled clinking of porcelain, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors, and the soft rustle of skirts. You follow it until you come upon another stately home, its windows glowing with candlelight. Through the lace curtains you see a tall woman in a stiff gown moving across the drawing room. She does not look like a mother, at least not in the way you might imagine. She is the governess, and this is her kingdom. The Victorian household was often less a family home and more a small institution, especially for the wealthy. Parents concerned with social obligations, entertaining guests, or simply maintaining appearances often delegated the raising of their children to others. Nannies, nurses, and governesses became the true guardians of childhood. Children grew up in nurseries on the top floors of houses, far from the elegant drawing rooms and dinner parties below. It was a life of separation. Children saw their parents for a brief visit in the evenings, sometimes no more than an hour, often less. Historians still argue whether this distance was damaging or protective. Some suggest that children raised by caring nurses and governesses actually received more consistent attention than they might have from distracted or emotionally distant parents. Others argue that it created a gulf between generations, leaving children craving affection from parents they rarely saw. You stand quietly in the corner, watching a little boy cling to the skirt of his governess while his mother sweeps past him, barely sparing a glance. The boy looks up hopefully, but the moment is gone. The governess herself is a curious figure, usually a young, unmarried woman from a genteel but financially strained family. She lived in the household but did not quite belong to it. She was above the servants, yet not fully part of the family. Imagine being at a dinner party where you're seated at the kids' table, but you're also expected to make conversation about politics and Shakespeare. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. In the nursery, you notice a strict routine. Lessons in reading, arithmetic, and geography are delivered with precision, often by the governess herself. Discipline is gentler here than in the factory, but it is still discipline. A child who misbehaves might be sent to bed early, made to copy lines, or denied sweets. The expectation is the same as always: obedience, order, and moral rectitude. And yet there are small acts of rebellion. You catch a girl sneaking a fairy tale book behind her arithmetic primer, her eyes shining as she reads about princesses and dragons instead of fractions. One particularly quirky practice you observe is the silent meal. In many wealthy households, children were expected to eat in complete silence in the nursery. Talking was considered disruptive, even dangerous to digestion. The governess would sit stiffly at the head of the table, watching like a hawk as children carefully lifted spoons and chewed with perfect decorum. You imagine yourself trying to eat spaghetti without slurping, in total silence, with someone glaring at you for every noodle. It's enough to make you want to giggle nervously, and in a Victorian nursery, that giggle could cost you dessert. The absence of parents in daily life left its mark. Many Victorian children grew up knowing their governess better than their mothers. They confided their secrets to her, not to the woman who gave them life. Fathers were often distant figures, appearing only to scold or to assess progress in lessons. Some children even described their parents as strangers, people to whom they owed respect but from whom they received little affection. It was a curious inversion. The household existed for the parents' reputations, but the children were raised by others. As you drift down the hallway, you pass a room filled with toys. Wooden soldiers stand in neat rows, dolls sit propped against miniature chairs, and a rocking horse waits patiently in the corner. But the door is locked. The toys are not for free play. They are rewards, doled out sparingly for good behavior. Play itself was considered suspicious, something to be monitored, structured, and limited. You can almost hear the governess's voice. 10 minutes of dolls, and then back to your spelling. It's like being told you can only watch a single TikTok video before returning to your homework, cruel in its precision. Yet not every governess was harsh. You find one kneeling on the floor beside her pupils, guiding their small fingers as they sew simple stitches into cloth. Her voice is gentle, her patience remarkable. In moments like these, the governess becomes a surrogate mother, offering the warmth and guidance that parents often withheld. For some children, the governess was the one person who truly knew them, the one who saw them not as reflections of family honor, but as small, curious beings with hopes and fears of their own. Of course, the governess herself lived a difficult life. She was often lonely, caught between the servants who resented her and the parents who saw her as hired help rather than an equal. Many governesses were poorly paid, their futures uncertain. Marriage was usually their only escape, yet their ambiguous social position made suitable matches hard to find. In some ways, the governess and her charges were alike, both trapped in a system that demanded obedience while offering little affection in return. Historians still debate whether the reliance on governesses weakened family bonds, or simply reflected the realities of class and status in Victorian England. Some argue it allowed children to receive a better education than their parents could provide. Others suggest it created generations of emotionally distant aristocrats, unpracticed in intimacy. You can't help but think of how different things are today, when parenting advice floods social media feeds and parents are encouraged to spend as much time as possible with their children. In the Victorian world, however, quality time with your parents might mean a stiff handshake before bedtime. As you step back into the cold night air, the contrast is stark. Behind you, children sit in silence, their governess watching with hawk-like eyes. Ahead, you hear a different sound, rougher, louder, less refined. It's the shout of a boy hawking newspapers, the clang of a shoemaker's hammer, the laughter of children darting between carts. These are not the sheltered children of the upper classes, nor the hidden scavengers of the factories. These are the working children of the street, and their rules are no less strict. For them, play is a luxury they can't afford, and every day is a battle for survival. You pull your cloak tighter and follow the sound of their voices, deeper into the restless night of Victorian London. You follow the sound of those hurried footsteps, the clack of wooden clogs and the soft scuff of bare feet against stone. The alley opens onto a wider street where gas lamps flicker against rows of shops, their windows filled with goods most of these children will never afford. The air smells of smoke and roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart, but also of sewage drifting up from the gutters. The children here are not dressed in neat uniforms or starched collars. Their coats are threadbare, patched with scraps of fabric that don't quite match, and their faces are smudged with grime. Yet their eyes dart with a nervous energy, as though every passerby might be a customer or a threat. You watch as a thin boy no taller than your waist steps forward, clutching a rag and a tin of polish. "Shine your boots, sir," he calls to a gentleman striding past. The man glances down, sniffs, and waves him away. The boy shrugs, then darts toward another potential customer. To you, it looks heartbreaking. Such small shoulders carrying the weight of survival. But in the Victorian world, this was normal. Children were not only expected to help at home, but often to earn money, however meagre, to keep the family afloat. Work instead of play was the rule for thousands of Victorian children. Some became street sellers, hawking matches, flowers, or newspapers. Others carried water buckets through alleys, offering a sip for a penny. Many were mudlarks, scavenging along the foul banks of the Thames for bits of coal, scraps of rope, or anything they could sell. Imagine yourself, sleeves rolled up, wading through icy black water thick with sewage, eyes scanning for a broken spoon or lump of coal you could trade for a half loaf of bread. Not exactly the kind of treasure hunt you'd want to brag about at school. Historians still argue whether this constant work robbed children entirely of childhood, or whether it gave them skills and resilience that would later serve them well. Some point to the stories of children who grew into successful entrepreneurs, their early struggles forging a kind of resourcefulness. Others remind us that for every child who made it, countless others fell sick, starved, or simply vanished into the shadows of the city. As you continue walking, you see two young girls with trays of violets. They approach couples strolling arm in arm, their voices sweet as they plead. "Buy a posy, miss? Fresh violets for your hair?" One gentleman dismisses them with a wave of his cane, muttering about beggars. Another woman buys a flower, but for far less than it's worth. The girls exchange glances, relief mixed with disappointment. A penny is still a penny after all. You can almost hear them whispering to each other, "One more sale and we can buy bread for the baby." In another corner, a group of boys cluster around a single candle, their newspapers tucked under their arms. They argue loudly about who will sell the most by dawn. Their competition is fierce, but you can sense a strange camaraderie beneath it all, as though their shared struggle binds them tighter than any adult's rules ever could. One boy boasts that he sold a whole stack of papers in an hour. Another counters that he made twice as much by offering to carry parcels for tired shoppers. You can't help but smile at their scrappy creativity. Today's side hustle might be dog walking or streaming online, but here in the 1850s it's all about shoe polish and penny papers. Yet the streets are dangerous places for children. You watch as a constable rounds the corner, his lantern swinging. The boys scatter like startled birds, darting into alleys and doorways. To the Victorian authorities, children like these were suspicious by nature. They were often labelled street Arabs or juvenile delinquents, blamed for the city's petty crime. Some were caught and dragged before magistrates, sentenced to days of hard labour in a reformatory, or even shipped overseas to colonies as apprentices. You shiver, imagining yourself being hauled off in irons for the crime of trying to make a living. It makes your late-night worries, like whether you left the stove on, feel almost laughably small. As you continue your quiet walk, you pass a makeshift shelter under a bridge. A cluster of children huddle together for warmth, sharing a single thin blanket. One of them pulls out a small tin whistle and begins to play a tune, something bright and clumsy, a melody that wobbles but refuses to die. The others giggle and clap their hands, turning a cold, damp night into a kind of celebration. You can't help but feel a swell of admiration. Even here in the darkest corners of the city, these children carve out moments of joy. It's a reminder that play, though denied to them by parents, teachers and employers, still found a way to survive. There's a strange irony in it all. While wealthy parents worried endlessly about spoiling their children with too much affection, these street children would have given anything for even the smallest sign of comfort. Historians still debate whether society truly believed it was saving children through strict discipline and labour, or whether it simply turned cruelty into a moral virtue. You can imagine those debates echoing in Parliament, while the children outside slept on the stones. As the night stretches on, the street sellers begin to disappear, their voices fading into the fog. You continue walking, the clack of clogs replaced by the hush of the river nearby. The Thames lies ahead, dark and sluggish, carrying with it the city's refuse and secrets. And on its muddy banks you see movement, small figures, bent low, their hands sifting through filth for anything of value. You are about to step into their world, the world of mudlarks, chimney sweeps, and child labourers whose playtime was stolen, whose childhoods were replaced by toil, and, though you might be longing for the softness of your own pillow by now, your journey through the harsh rules of Victorian parenting has only just begun to reveal its darkest corners. The river greets you like a living creature, sluggish and dark, its surface broken by drifting debris and the occasional ripple of a rat slipping into the water. The air here is damp and sour, thick with the smell of rotting vegetables, dead fish, and the ever-present stench of sewage. The Thames in Victorian London was no picturesque waterway. It was an open sewer, a carrier of waste and disease. Yet for countless children, this foul riverbank was their workplace, their playground, and in some cases, their home. You notice a group of boys and girls crouched low in the mud, their hands blackened and raw as they sift through the filth. They are mudlarks, children who spend their days searching for scraps, bits of coal fallen from barges, nails, bones, or any small item that could be cleaned and sold for a penny or two. It's back-breaking work, often done barefoot in the freezing muck, with the river tide lapping dangerously close. To you, it looks like the world's most miserable beachcombing expedition. To them, it is survival. One boy, no older than 8, lets out a triumphant shout as he pulls a chunk of coal from the mud. He wipes it on his already filthy shirt and tucks it into a sack that looks heavier than he does. His little sister claps, not because she enjoys the game, but because that lump of coal means a slightly warmer fire tonight. The contrast between their joy and their circumstances makes your chest ache. You almost want to step forward and hand them a blanket or a loaf of bread, but you remain a silent observer, a ghost in this fog-soaked past. Victorian society often looked down on these children, labelling them as urchins, vagabonds, or future criminals. Newspapers sometimes portrayed them as symbols of urban decay, ragged figures haunting the edges of the respectable city. Yet without their labour, families would have starved. Historians still argue whether the children themselves saw their work as degrading or whether, in their own way, they took pride in contributing. Some memoirs suggest that mudlarks saw themselves as adventurers scavenging treasures from the river. Others, however, recall the cold, the hunger, and the ever-present fear of drowning in the dark water. You watch as two boys tug on the same length of rope half buried in the mud. Their boots sink deeper, and one boy slips, splattering the other in sludge. For a moment there's anger, a shove, a shout, but then both start laughing, rolling in the muck as if it were a game of tag. For them, laughter is risky. A constable could appear at any moment ready to drag them away for loitering, but the giggles bubble out anyway, uncontrollable, as if joy itself is a form of rebellion. You might think about times you've laughed in situations you shouldn't have, maybe during a serious lecture or a solemn ceremony, and realize these children risked far more than embarrassment. For them, even laughter could invite punishment. As dawn begins to lighten the river, the children gather their findings. A girl carries a basket filled with bits of rope and rusty nails. Another boy hauls a sack of coal so large he stumbles under its weight. They will sell their collections to rag and bone men, who pay pennies for scraps that can be reused or resold. It's not enough to lift their families out of poverty, but it might mean one more day of bread, one more night with a fire. The day is just beginning, but these children are already exhausted. Some trudge home to collapse on straw mattresses, others move on to new work, perhaps shining boots or selling flowers in the market. For them, childhood is a series of tasks, a schedule dictated not by play, but by survival. You think of your own childhood mornings, perhaps dragging yourself out of bed for school, grumbling about homework, and realize that compared to these children you were living in luxury. One quirky detail you notice is the strange economy of the streets. A single piece of coal might buy a crust of bread. A handful of bones could be sold to soap makers for pennies. Children even collected dog dung, which was used in tanneries to soften leather. Imagine spending your day running around after stray dogs, scooping up their mess, and then proudly handing it over for a coin. You might complain about chores, but at least yours don't involve, well, that. As the morning sun begins to pierce the fog, you follow a group of children up from the riverbank into the bustling market. The streets are already alive with noise, vendors shouting prices, carriages rattling past, dogs barking. The children weave through the crowds with practiced ease, their eyes scanning for opportunities. One boy tugs at a gentleman's sleeve, waving a newspaper in his face. Another girl holds out a basket of flowers, her voice sweet as she begs for a penny. It strikes you how invisible these children are. Adults brush past them as though they are part of the street furniture, barely acknowledging their existence unless they get in the way. And yet without them the city would falter. They deliver papers, carry parcels, polish boots, sell matches and scavenge resources. They are the hidden gears of the great Victorian machine. And still, when they collapse from exhaustion or fall ill from the filth, society looks at them with disdain, blaming them for their own suffering. Historians still debate whether these children should be remembered primarily as victims or as survivors. On one hand, their labor shortened their lives, robbed them of education, and left them vulnerable to exploitation. On the other hand, their ingenuity, the way they turned scraps into survival, the way they found moments of joy in the darkest places, speaks to a resilience that is hard not to admire. Perhaps both these things can be true. You linger a moment longer, watching a small boy carefully place his last match into the hand of a weary woman. She gives him a halfpenny in return, and he beams as though he has just been handed a king's ransom. He clutches the coin tightly, already imagining the bread it will buy. And then, as the market swallows him up, you hear another sound drifting from a nearby building. It is not the clatter of looms or the cries of street vendors, but something softer. The murmur of children's voices reciting words in unison, the rise and fall of a teacher's commands. You turn toward the sound, drawn once again into the rhythm of this city. Ahead lies the world of education, where children were meant to be shaped not by mud and soot, but by lessons drilled into weary minds. You take a deep breath, preparing yourself, because if the streets were cruel in their neglect, the classrooms you are about to enter will be cruel in their precision, and somewhere inside another story waits to unfold, of chalk dust, memorized verses, and the unyielding weight of Victorian expectations. The voices of children chanting lessons lead you away from the muddy banks and into the heart of a squat stone building whose windows glow faintly in the half-light of morning. The door creaks open at your touch, and suddenly you're standing at the back of a long, drafty classroom. Rows of wooden desks stretch before you like soldiers on parade. each one filled with a child sitting bolt upright, slate and chalk in hand. The air is thick with the smell of damp wool, lamp smoke and ink. The teacher stands at the front, tall and forbidding, pointer rod tapping rhythmically against the blackboard. The children's voices rise and fall together in a practiced chant. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. Over and over the words repeat until they begin to sound more like a spell than a multiplication table. You can almost feel yourself slipping into the rhythm, lulled by the repetition. And that was, in a way, the point. Victorian education was not designed to spark curiosity or creativity. It was designed to instill order, obedience, and the ability to memorize without question. Historians still argue whether this approach built intellectual discipline or stifled imagination. Some point out that Britain's scientific and industrial achievements soared during this period, suggesting that something about the Victorian emphasis on rigor paid off. Others argue that innovation flourished despite the rigid schools, not because of them, and that the greatest minds of the era often succeeded by breaking free of the very rules they were taught. You can almost imagine Charles Darwin as a boy fidgeting in a schoolroom like this, dreaming of beetles and fossils while a teacher droned on about Latin grammar. Discipline in the classroom often mirrored discipline at home. Children were expected to sit perfectly still for hours at a time, their eyes fixed on the blackboard, their mouths shut unless called upon. If a child yawned, they risked a sharp rap across the knuckles. If they slouched, they might be forced to wear a wooden backboard to correct their posture. You picture yourself trying to sit upright for 6 straight hours without once checking your phone or stretching your legs. Honestly, you'd probably be begging for detention just to move around. One boy in the corner is clearly struggling. His head droops forward and his chalk scratches nonsense across the slate. He's fallen asleep, sitting up, the endless chant lulling him into unconsciousness. The teacher notices. With a swift motion, the rod smacks against the desk beside the boy's hand, startling him awake. The class doesn't laugh, they know better, but you can feel the tension ripple through the room. The boy rubs his eyes and sits straighter, though his lids are still heavy. The day is only beginning, and already he is exhausted. Yet there were other forms of learning, ones that offered a glimpse of something brighter. In some classrooms, children were introduced to the wonders of geography. You see a large map pinned to the wall, brightly coloured with pink patches marking the British Empire's far-flung territories. The teacher points to India, to Africa, to Australia, speaking of strange animals, exotic spices, and lands filled with possibility. For children trapped in the monotony of the classroom, these lessons were windows to another world. You can almost feel the excitement ripple through the rows as the children imagine themselves sailing across oceans, discovering new lands, or perhaps even ruling them one day. But even these lessons were tinged with control. Geography wasn't just about learning the shape of the world, it was about teaching children their place in it. Britain was the centre, the jewel, and everything else was described in terms of how it served the empire. The lesson was clear. Your role as a child of Victorian England is to uphold this grand structure, even if it costs you your comfort, your freedom, or your joy. A curious little detail draws your attention to the corner of the classroom. On a shelf sits a bell jar, inside of which rests a stuffed bird perched on a twig. It's not a toy, not a pet, it's a teaching aid. Victorians loved to preserve animals in glass cases, believing it gave children a way to study nature without the chaos of actual living creatures. You can almost imagine a child pressing their nose to the glass, wondering what it would be like if the bird could sing. Today, we might take children to a zoo or a science museum. In Victorian times, the closest they got to wildlife was a stuffed sparrow under glass. After hours of recitations and lectures, the children are finally released for a short break. They shuffle into a narrow courtyard, their black boots kicking up little puffs of dust. At first they stand awkwardly, as though unsure what to do without direct instruction. Then, slowly, one boy pulls a ball from his pocket, a small leather sphere, scuffed and patched. Another boy kicks it back, and before long a hesitant game begins. The ball bounces against the walls, children dart and laugh, and for a fleeting moment the rigid rules of the classroom fall away. Of course, the teacher soon reappears, and the laughter stops instantly. The ball vanishes back into a pocket, and the children shuffle into line once more. You can't help but feel the weight of it all, how even the smallest joys are rationed, allowed only in short bursts, always under watchful eyes. It's like being given a single piece of candy and told to savor it for an entire week. Sweet, yes, but also unbearably fleeting. As the school day winds down, you watch the children gather their books and slates. Some will return to families who barely notice them. Others will trudge back to tenements where more work awaits. The line between school and labor is thin, blurred by the relentless demands of survival. Education, like everything else in Victorian childhood, is less about joy and more about preparation for work, for duty, for silence. Historians still debate whether Victorian education was a necessary step in building the literate workforce of the modern world, or whether it crushed more spirits than it saved. What's certain is that for the children living it, the classroom was not a sanctuary, but another space of rules, discipline, and performance. You step back out into the fog, the sound of chanting fading into the night. The city feels quieter now, though you know it never truly sleeps. Somewhere in the distance you hear a faint melody, soft, haunting, and strangely familiar. It isn't the clatter of machines or the crack of a cane, but the gentle rhythm of a lullaby drifting from an upstairs window. And with that sound guiding you, you continue forward, ready to discover how Victorian parents used stories and songs to shape their children's dreams, sometimes with tenderness and sometimes with fear. The lullaby lingers in the air as you approach the tall house, its upper windows glowing faintly in the early dawn. The fog outside softens the sound, making the tune seem as though it comes from far away, drifting down from the rafters like a ghost. You climb the creaking stairs and step into a nursery lit by a single oil lamp. Here, the strict lines of the schoolroom give way to a softer, though no less controlled, environment. The walls are painted a pale blue, chipped in places, and the floorboards creak under the weight of a rocking chair. A nursemaid sits by the fire, rocking gently, a bundle wrapped in white linen cradled in her arms. She hums an old melody, one you almost recognize. It's not the sweet lullabies you might expect, no twinkling stars or gentle wishes for sleep. Instead, the words drift like shadows, warnings of children who wandered too far or who disobeyed their elders and met dark fates. In the Victorian world, stories were often not just entertainment, but cautionary tales meant to scare children into obedience. A bedtime story could just as easily be a bedtime threat. Imagine being tucked into bed expecting a comforting tale about a brave rabbit or a friendly giant, only to be told about a little girl who sucked her thumb until a man with giant scissors came and chopped it clean off. That's not a joke. It's actually the plot of a real Victorian children's story from Struwwelpeter, a book written in 1845 by Heinrich Hoffmann. The tale was meant to frighten children out of bad habits. And if you're thinking, wow, I'm glad my bedtime stories were about wizards and dragons instead of thumb slicing, you're not alone. Many modern readers find these stories shocking, though to Victorians they were simply practical lessons wrapped in rhyme. Historians still argue about the effects of these cautionary tales. Some suggest that they successfully deterred dangerous or undesirable behavior, while others believe they left deep scars, filling children's dreams with fear rather than wonder. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between. Children may have been scared into obedience, yes, but they also found ways to reinterpret these tales, laughing at the absurdity of a boy with fingernails so long they curled like claws. As you watch the children in the nursery, you notice their bedtime ritual. The governess reads aloud from a small, worn book, her voice steady and serious. The children lie in their beds, their eyes wide as they listen to a story about a disobedient boy who played with matches and burned to ash. One child grips the blanket tighter, another hides under the covers. For them, the story is not entertainment. It is a warning, a reminder that danger lurks in every corner and that only obedience can keep them safe. But then, after the governess leaves, something shifts. The children peek out from their covers, whispering to each other. One boy makes a face, imitating the stern tones of the governess, and the others stifle giggles. Another child whispers a silly ending to the story, turning the burned boy into a soot-smeared ghost who dances on the rooftops, playing tricks on chimney sweeps. Their laughter is hushed, careful not to draw attention, but it is laughter all the same. Even in the midst of warnings and fear, the children find a way to turn their nightmares into games. You drift closer, listening to the faint sound of their whispers. One child has a tiny wooden doll, its paint chipped and faded. She uses it to act out the story, pretending the doll is the reckless boy with the matches. The others watch, wide-eyed, as she invents a new ending where the doll escapes into the garden and finds safety among the roses. For a moment you feel warmth in the room, an oasis of imagination in a set of rules. The toys themselves tell a story. Most are simple: wooden hoops, cloth dolls, marbles carved from stone or glass. For wealthier children there might be mechanical toys, tiny tin soldiers that marched stiffly, or miniature carriages pulled by clockwork horses. But the purpose of these toys was often practical. Dolls were meant to prepare girls for motherhood, teaching them how to care for babies. Building blocks taught boys patience, geometry, and, supposedly, the virtues of order. Play was tolerated, but only if it served the larger purpose of preparing children for their adult roles. One quirky toy catches your eye: a set of Noah's Ark animals, all neatly carved from wood and painted in bright colors. These toys were especially popular because they were considered religiously appropriate. After all, who could object to children playing with tiny pairs of animals marching into the ark? But you notice that the children don't play with them as the adults intended. Instead of carefully marching the animals 2 by 2, the children invent a story where the lions escape and chase the elephants around the room. The laughter bubbles up again, a soft, defiant joy that feels almost revolutionary in this house of rules. The governess returns, frowning, and the animals are quickly shoved under the bed. The children lie still once more, eyes squeezed shut, pretending to be asleep. The governess lingers for a moment, then leaves again, the door clicking shut. Silence settles like a heavy blanket, broken only by the sound of breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. Historians still debate whether Victorian children truly lacked play, or whether they simply moved it underground into secret games, whispered stories, and hidden toys. Some argue that play was more present than we imagine, just less visible because it was confined to private moments. Others insist that the fear and the discipline of the era crushed spontaneity, leaving children ill-prepared for joy. As you stand in the dim nursery, you suspect both are true. Childhood joy was not absent. It was simply forced into hiding, blooming like a flower in the cracks of stone. You step back into the hallway, the sound of the lullaby fading into silence. The house is quiet now, the children finally asleep, their dreams no doubt filled with the strange mixture of fear and fantasy that defined their world. You continue your walk, the floorboards creaking softly beneath your invisible feet. Ahead, you hear another sound, different from laughter or lullabies. It is the low murmur of adult voices, serious and stern, punctuated by the occasional sharp exclamation. You follow the sound down the stairs into a room lined with heavy bookshelves. A group of adults sit around a polished table, their faces lit by lamplight. They speak in hushed but urgent tones about the moral state of the nation, about the dangers of idleness, and about the need to instill obedience from the cradle. Here, in the very heart of Victorian respectability, you begin to understand the philosophy that justified all the strict rules, the punishments, and even the stories meant to terrify children into submission. You linger at the edge of the drawing room, the lamplight spilling out across the polished wood floor. The air inside smells faintly of pipe smoke, beeswax polish, and the lingering sweetness of brandy. Around a long mahogany table sit several men in waistcoats and tailcoats, their faces stern, their hair slicked back. A few women perch stiffly on straight-backed chairs, their gloved hands folded neatly in their laps. These are the guardians of Victorian morality, the parents, ministers and reformers who believed they were shaping not just their own families but the future of the empire itself. Their voices rise and fall in debate, punctuated by the occasional sharp rap of a cane against the table. One man declares that children must be taught to fear disobedience from the moment they can walk. Another insists that indulgence is the ruin of society, that a child who is spoiled will grow into a criminal or worse, an idle dreamer. A mother with tired eyes nods gravely, though you catch the flicker of doubt in her gaze. For many parents, affection was a private desire, constantly at war with the public expectation of discipline. Historians still argue about what motivated this obsession with control. Some see it as a reaction to the chaos of industrialization, a way for families to cling to order in a world that was changing too quickly. Others point to the influence of evangelical religion, which preached that children were born with sinful natures that had to be corrected early and firmly. Either way, the result was the same, a culture where children were expected to obey without question, where even love was rationed like sugar. You drift closer to the table, listening as one man quotes from a popular parenting manual of the time. He reads aloud a passage urging parents never to indulge a child's tears. A crying child, the manual insists, is a selfish child. The room nods in agreement, though you can't help but wince. Imagine being told that every time you cried, it wasn't a sign of pain or sadness, but of weakness. You think back to the last time you teared up at a movie or stubbed your toe. In the Victorian home, you'd probably be punished for it. Not exactly the soothing environment anyone would want before drifting to sleep. Nearby, a fireplace crackles, its warmth reaching even you, though you're not really there. Above the mantel hangs a portrait of Queen Victoria herself, gazing down with solemn eyes. To Victorians, she was more than a monarch. She was the model of domestic virtue, the embodiment of duty and family life. Parents measured themselves against her ideal, striving to cultivate the same sense of order and morality in their own homes. But beneath that gaze, you sense an unspoken tension. How many mothers and fathers truly felt capable of living up to such a standard? How many found themselves enforcing rules they didn't fully believe in simply because society demanded it? There's a peculiar ritual taking place now. The adults have begun discussing the day's family devotions. Each child is called down, one by one, to recite a verse from Scripture. The parents nod approvingly, praising accuracy but showing little warmth. When one boy stumbles over a word, his father's brow darkens. The governess rushes to correct him, her voice sharp with anxiety. After all, his failure reflects poorly, not just on himself, but on her as well. You can feel the pressure in the room, the weight of every expectation pressing down on these children as if the air itself were heavy. And yet, even here, rebellion simmers quietly. A little girl recites her verse flawlessly, but when she turns to leave, you notice the faint smudge of ink on her sleeve. She's been doodling again, sneaking moments of imagination into her day. Her father doesn't notice, but you do. It's a reminder that children, no matter how tightly controlled, will always find cracks in the rules where their spirits can breathe. One quirky detail you notice is a pamphlet lying on the table titled Hints on Household Government. Its author insists that children should be bathed in cold water every morning to strengthen their character, and that they should be dressed in plain clothing to avoid vanity. You almost chuckle at the thought. Imagine a Victorian parent walking into a modern children's store surrounded by glittery backpacks and dinosaur pajamas and trying to find something plain enough. They'd probably faint in the aisle. As the adults continue their discussion, you sense their fear beneath the stern words. They speak of rising crime, of political unrest, of the dangers of poverty. To them, strict discipline is not cruelty, it is protection. They believe that by shaping their children into obedient, hard-working citizens, they are safeguarding the future of Britain itself. Whether that belief was noble or misguided, historians still debate. But what is clear is that the burden of that fear was placed squarely on the shoulders of children. You step back into the hall, the voices fading behind you. The house is still, but outside you hear the city stir again. The fog has lifted slightly, revealing the outlines of tall buildings against the pale morning sky. The streets are beginning to fill once more with carts, vendors, and children heading to work. As you walk, you pass another home, this one less grand, its bricks cracked and its windows patched with paper. Inside, a mother bends over a wash tub, her hands red and raw from scrubbing. A little boy sits beside her, shelling peas, while his sister rocks a baby in a rough wooden cradle. This is another kind of Victorian childhood, one defined not by governesses or tutors, but by endless chores. For these children, work begins not at the factory gate or on the riverbank, but right here at home. And as you watch the boy fumble with these, EPs dropping more on the floor than into the bowl. You realize that the line between work and play is even blurrier than you thought. For him, this might feel like a game, but his mother's weary sigh tells another story. Those peas are dinner, and every lost one is a mouthful they cannot afford to waste. You step closer, listening to the sound of shells cracking, the baby's cries, and the drip of water from the washtub. The world of Victorian children is not only one of discipline and punishment, but of constant labor, whether in factories, on the streets, or within their own homes. You move on, following the sound of the boys' dropped peas as they scatter across the wooden floor. Ahead you hear something else, laughter, high-pitched and fleeting, carried on the morning air. Could it be that in this world of discipline and toil, there is still space for joy? Your feet quicken, eager to find out, as the next chapter of this long and weary journey beckons. The laughter you heard is not the careful, muffled kind of giggle you've grown used to overhearing in dark nurseries or crowded schoolrooms. No, this sound is freer, louder, tinged with the reckless abandon of children who, for just a few minutes, have forgotten the weight of rules. You follow the sound through a narrow street and find yourself peering through the window of yet another home. Inside, a long dining table stretches across the room, its polished surface reflecting the flickering glow of candles. Silverware gleams in neat rows, glasses stand like soldiers at attention, and stiff-backed chairs are arranged with military precision. Here, the family is gathering for their evening meal. The father sits at the head of the table, his posture straight as a ruler, his expression unreadable. The mother sits opposite him, her gown rustling faintly as she arranges her napkin just so. The children, 3 of them tonight, slide into their seats without a word. The air feels charged, as though you've stepped into a theatre moments before the curtain rises. Everyone knows their part, everyone knows the script. The ritual begins with grace. Heads bow, hands clasp, and the father recites a prayer in a deep, solemn voice. The children murmur the responses, their voices barely audible. When the prayer ends, silence fills the room again. Servants step forward to lay dishes on the table. Thin soup, a loaf of bread, perhaps a small roast if the family can afford it. The children glance at the food with hungry eyes, but none dare move until their father gives the signal. You watch as the eldest boy carefully lifts his spoon, holding it in his right hand, just so. He leans forward, but only slightly, careful not to let his elbows touch the table. The younger sister mimics him, though her hand trembles, and a single drop of soup splashes onto the tablecloth. The mother's sharp intake of breath cuts through the silence like a blade. The girl's face pales, and she immediately lowers her spoon, murmuring an apology. No one laughs, no one offers comfort. Instead, the family continues eating in silence, the girl's mistake hanging in the air like smoke. Victorian meals were not simply about nourishment, they were about discipline, about proving that the family was respectable and controlled. Children were expected to sit silently, to eat with perfect manners, and to listen attentively if an adult chose to speak. Conversation was often a one-way street, flowing from parent to child in the form of lectures or questions designed to test their knowledge. Imagine being asked to recite your multiplication tables while trying not to spill your soup. It would be like having a pop quiz every time you sat down for dinner. Historians still argue whether these strict dining rituals were truly about teaching manners or whether they were about control. Some suggest that they prepared children for a world in which social appearances mattered above all. Others argue that the constant surveillance and lack of warmth at the dinner table stifled family bonds, leaving children emotionally starved even when their bellies were full. You glance around the table and notice a curious detail. Each child's chair has a small wooden bar across the bottom, designed to keep their feet in place. In some homes, children were even strapped to their chairs during meals to ensure they didn't fidget. It's a strange sight, tiny legs bound in place while silver cutlery gleams beside them. You can't help but think of the last time you tried to sit through a long dinner party without fidgeting. If someone had tied your legs down, you'd probably have wriggled harder just to spite them. And yet, in the midst of all this silence, there are small cracks in the performance. The youngest child, perhaps only 5 years old, sneaks a piece of bread into his lap when no one is looking. He tears off tiny bites, his eyes darting nervously toward his father at the head of the table. The boy's sister notices and covers her mouth to hide a smile. For a brief moment you can feel the warmth of their shared secret, a tiny act of rebellion against the suffocating rules of the household. After dinner, the family files back into the parlor for evening prayers. The children kneel stiffly, their hands folded, their eyes shut tight. The father's voice drones on, reciting scripture, while the mother's lips move in silent agreement. The children sway slightly, exhausted from the day, but none dare slump or yawn. One boy's head begins to droop, and his sister nudges him sharply in the ribs to keep him awake. You almost laugh, remembering the times you fought sleep during late-night movies or school assemblies, your head bobbing like a balloon on a string. Here, though, that same slip would earn a scolding, or worse. When the prayers finally end, the children are dismissed to bed. They march up the stairs in silence, their small feet barely making a sound on the steps. The house grows quieter, the only noises the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional clink of glass as the adults pour themselves another round of brandy. You realize that in this world, meals are not about family connection, but about control, about rehearsing for the roles children are expected to play as adults. Historians still debate how much of this rigidity was truly practiced and how much was idealized in books and manuals. Some argue that not every Victorian family was so strict that many parents allowed laughter and conversation at the dinner table. Others insist that for the middle and upper classes, the pressure to maintain appearances was too great, and that silence at supper was more common than not. Whatever the truth, the children you've seen tonight live in a world where even eating is an exercise in restraint. You step back into the night, the fog curling around your ankles once more. The streets are quieter now, but the city still hums beneath the silence, a living machine of soot and shadows. As you walk, you hear a new sound, softer, more secretive. It's the faint rustle of fabric, the muffled thud of small feet on floorboards, and the sound of whispers carried through the night air. These are not the chants of a classroom or the cries of a workhouse. They are the voices of children telling stories, inventing tales of giants, witches, and talking animals. You smile faintly as you follow the sound, realizing that in the world of Victorian children, even stories, those fragile threads of imagination, were twisted into lessons of fear and obedience. But once the adults left the room, the children reclaimed them, reshaping warnings into wonders. Ahead, you see the glow of another nursery window, and you know you're about to slip into a world where bedtime was never just about sleep, but about the stories that haunted or comforted the night. You drift toward that glow in the high window, the whispers growing louder as you approach. The nursery door stands slightly ajar, and you slip inside without a sound. The room is dim, lit only by a single candle that sputters in a draught, its light stretching the shadows of the furniture across the floor. The children are huddled together on one large bed, their faces pale in the flickering glow, their eyes wide and watchful. The governess has retired for the night, leaving them alone with their thoughts. And what fills that silence? Not giggles this time, but stories. Victorian children lived in a world obsessed with morality, and nowhere was this clearer than in the tales they were told. Bedtime stories were rarely gentle reassurances. Instead, they were cautionary fables filled with cruel punishments for the smallest missteps. You hear one child whispering the tale of Augustus, a boy from the infamous German book Struwwelpeter, who refuses to eat his soup. Day after day he grows thinner until, on the fifth day, he simply dies. The other children listen with horrified fascination, their faces pale and solemn. No one interrupts. The silence between sentences is heavier than the blankets wrapped around their knees. Another child takes a turn, recounting the tale of Pauline, who plays with matches despite her mother's warning. The story ends with Pauline burned to ashes, her red shoes left behind as the only evidence. You can almost feel the heat of the imagined flames in the room, see the candlelight flickering more wildly as the children's whispers grow urgent. It's not exactly the kind of story you'd want before bed. You think about your own bedtime tales, maybe whimsical adventures with talking animals or brave heroes, and realize how different it feels to drift off imagining magic versus imagining fiery punishment. Honestly, it's like the difference between listening to a chill playlist and falling asleep to someone reading you a horror novel. Historians still argue about whether these grim tales reflected genuine cruelty or whether they were simply products of their time, when fear was seen as the best teacher. Some argue that Victorian parents believed children would only learn obedience if they were terrified of the consequences of disobedience. Others suggest that children themselves reshaped these tales, laughing at the absurdity and turning them into entertainment when adults weren't watching. After all, what child doesn't secretly delight in the gruesome parts of a scary story, even while shivering under the covers? You watch as the youngest girl, no older than 5, pipes up with a story of her own. It's about a witch who lives in the forest, who snatches up children who wander too far from home. But in her version, the witch trips over a root and tumbles into a pond, her hat floating away like a small boat. The older children giggle, relieved by the silly twist. For a moment, the heavy rules of Victorian parenting seem far away, replaced by the warm glow of imagination. Still, you sense that the weight of those rules presses even here, in the sanctuary of the nursery. The children glance nervously toward the door after each burst of laughter, afraid that the governess might return. They know that playfulness, even in whispers, is not what's expected of them. The nursery, for all its toys and lullabies, is not truly theirs. It is a training ground, a place where every action is observed, corrected, and recorded. You notice one child clutching a small book under the covers. It isn't a Bible or a school primer, but a cheap penny dreadful, its cover depicting a pirate with a wild grin and a sword raised high. These little booklets, sold for a penny, were wildly popular among children, though parents often disapproved. Filled with sensational tales of crime, adventure, and supernatural horrors, penny dreadfuls were condemned as corrupting influences. Adults believed they would lead children astray, filling their heads with dangerous fantasies. But the children adored them. They devoured stories of highwaymen, monsters, and daring escapes, perhaps because these tales offered something their daily lives rarely did: adventure, excitement, and the possibility of escape. One quirky detail you notice is how children sometimes turned these stories into plays of their own. In one corner of the nursery, a boy ties a blanket around his shoulders like a cape and declares himself the hero of the story. His siblings cheer, though quietly, their eyes flicking nervously to the door. They know that if the governess catches them, there will be punishments: early bed, no supper, maybe even a scolding that echoes through the house. But for now, they revel in their stolen joy. As you stand in the shadowy nursery, you think about how stories, even frightening ones, gave Victorian children a way to process the rigid rules of their world. The tales their parents chose for them were meant to terrify them into obedience, but the stories they whispered among themselves were filled with defiance, humor, and hope. Historians still debate whether this secret storytelling helped children cope with their harsh realities, or whether it deepened their fears. Perhaps, like the soot-filled air of the city, it was both suffocating and sustaining at once. The candle on the bedside table gutters, throwing wild shadow against the wall. The children finally settle into silence, their breathing slowing as sleep claims them. You step back into the hallway, the door closing softly behind you. The house is quiet now, but the city outside is stirring again. You hear the creak of a cartwheel, the clink of a milk pail, the call of a costermonger hawking his wares. As you step into the street, the fog lifts just enough to reveal the wider city around you. The spires of churches rise into the pale morning sky, their bells tolling solemnly, and yet beneath that solemnity, you sense the weight of hidden burdens. For behind every neat row house, every schoolroom, every nursery, there are secrets. Secrets whispered in the dark, hidden in diaries, or carried silently by children who had no voice. And it is toward those closed doors, those hidden truths, that your feet now carry you. You follow the sound of whispers, softer this time, almost drowned out by the creak of carriages and the distant toll of bells. The streets narrow once more, and you find yourself before a row of houses whose windows are shuttered tight. Whatever lies inside, it is not meant for the public eye. You are about to step into the world of secrets, family scandals, private tragedies, and the burdens Victorian children bore in silence. The park before you is alive with motion. Dew clings to every blade of grass, sparkling faintly in the pale morning sun as children dart and weave across the open field. For the first time in what feels like hours, you hear unrestrained laughter, high, bubbling, and utterly human. Hoops roll across the gravel, chased by small boys with sticks. Girls clap hands in rhythm, singing sing-song rhymes about maidens, sailors, and the occasional mischievous cat. The air smells fresher here, though the distant tang of coal smoke still drifts in on the breeze, a reminder that the city's chimneys are never truly silent. For these children, playtime is a rare luxury. Their parents may have sent them out to exercise or air the lungs, believing that fresh air was essential to good health. It wasn't about fun, at least not officially, but about strengthening the body for future labor or ensuring the soul stayed pure. Yet the children, clever as ever, transformed this into something else. They used these brief freedoms to laugh, to run, to imagine worlds beyond the strict walls of home and school. You watch as two boys begin a mock sword fight with sticks. They slash and parry, their faces alight with excitement, until one of them trips and lands in a patch of mud. For a moment he looks shocked, his clean collar smeared with brown. You brace yourself, expecting him to burst into tears, but instead he laughs, loud, unrestrained, joyous. His friend laughs too, doubling over until he can barely breathe. They know there will be trouble when they return home with muddy clothes, but for now they revel in the moment. It's a kind of rebellion, a joyful defiance of rules that insist on silence and composure. Historians still argue about the place of play in Victorian childhood. Some claim that play was carefully structured, limited to games that reinforced discipline and gender roles. Boys were encouraged to play with toy soldiers or practice cricket, activities that prepared them for military or imperial service. Girls were given dolls and dollhouses, miniature teas and sewing kits, training them for lives as wives and mothers. Others argue that despite these restrictions, children always found ways to invent their own games, turning alleyways into battlefields, sticks into horses, and scraps of fabric into royal gowns. You notice one particularly lively group of girls playing a game of oranges and lemons, their voices rising in song as two children form an arch with their arms and the others run beneath. At the end of the rhyme, one child is caught and pulled aside, squealing with laughter. It's a game about sacrifice, about capture, about being chosen. To modern ears, the rhyme sounds almost eerie, with its references to debt, death, and the tolling of bells. But to the children, it's a chance to run, to laugh, to feel free for a few stolen minutes. You might compare it to the games of tag you played as a child, except here the rhymes sound more like a funeral dirge than a playground chant. On a nearby bench, a group of boys sit with scraps of paper and charcoal, sketching scenes from their imaginations. One draws a ship with sails so large they blot out the sun. Another sketches a dragon coiled around a castle tower. They huddle together, whispering about the adventures they'll have one day, about how they'll escape the soot and the rules and sail across oceans. You smile at their determination. Even in a world that tried to crush imagination with rules and punishments, children still dreamed, still played, still found ways to laugh. And yet, the shadow of discipline is never far away. A governess calls sharply from the edge of the park, her voice slicing through the laughter. The children freeze, their games ending in an instant. Hoops are dropped, sticks are thrown aside, and the children shuffle back into neat lines, their faces carefully blank. The governess counts them, her eyes narrowing as she notices the mud stains on collars and hems. Her lips press into a thin line, and you know what awaits those boys when they return home. One curious detail catches your eye as the children line up. A boy holds a small paper kite, its string trailing in the grass. The kite itself is nothing more than scraps of newspaper pasted together with flour and water, but to him it is treasure. He hides it quickly behind his back, slipping it into his coat as the governess marches past. That scrap of paper, flimsy as it is, represents something far larger: freedom, the chance to run, to lift his eyes to the sky instead of lowering them to the ground. As the children are herded back toward their homes, the park grows quiet again. The dew has begun to evaporate, leaving the grass damp but no longer sparkling. The laughter that filled the air only minutes ago fades into memory, replaced once more by the familiar sounds of the city. Carriages rattling, vendors shouting, bells tolling in the distance. You can feel the weight of discipline settling back over the children, as though the park's brief reprieve never happened. Historians still debate whether these moments of play truly balanced the harshness of Victorian childhood, or whether they were too fleeting to make a difference. Some argue that even a few stolen moments of joy could sustain a child through long hours of labor and discipline. Others insist that the cruelty of the era overshadowed whatever brief happiness they found. As you reflect on what you've seen, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in the tension between the two, that laughter was both a relief and a reminder of how little freedom they had. You step out of the park, the silence of the city closing in around you once more. The fog thickens as the day fades, and the streets grow dim. Ahead you hear a new sound, sharper, louder, and filled with urgency. It is not laughter this time, nor the chants of a classroom. It is the sound of voices raised in protest, of people shouting in defiance. You follow the noise, your steps quickening, until you see a crowd gathering in the street. Children stand among them, their small faces lit by the glow of lanterns, their voices blending with the roar. Here, at last, you find not silence, not obedience, but resistance. In a world built on strict rules and relentless discipline, some children, and the adults who cared for them, are beginning to fight back. You are about to witness the shadows shift, as reformers and rebels step forward to challenge the cruelty of Victorian parenting. The crowd swells before you, a restless tide of voices filling the fog-streaked street. Torches flare against the soot-stained brick, and banners ripple in the night air. Men in work coats shout about fair wages. Women clutch their shawls tightly as they call for bread and mercy. And among them, you see children, their small hands gripping the hems of skirts or clutching wooden placards that wobble in the glow. The air is thick with coal dust and candle smoke, yet it vibrates with something new, defiance. You step closer and realize this is no ordinary gathering. This is a protest, one of many that swept across Victorian England. Reformers had begun to speak out against child labour, against the cruelty of workhouses, against the silence forced into homes and schools. The children, though still expected to obey, were sometimes drawn into these protests, their very presence a weapon. A child in rags, coughing in the cold, was a powerful reminder of what society demanded and what it destroyed. At the front of the crowd, a woman raises her voice, calling for laws to protect the youngest workers. She is no queen, no titled lady, but an ordinary mother who has seen too much suffering. Her words ring out over the crowd, carried by the fog. "They are children, not machines," she cries, and the people around her cheer. You imagine her voice cutting through the thick London air like a bell, each phrase a challenge to the rigid rules that had defined generations. Historians still argue about how much influence these reformers truly had. Some suggest their efforts were the turning point, leading to the Factory Acts that limited children's working hours and set minimum ages for employment. Others argue that economic changes, the rise of machines that no longer needed child labour, did more to end the practice than any amount of moral outrage. Whatever the cause, the result was grad sanadias. All but undeniable, the world of Victorian children began to change. And yet, even as laws were passed, cruelty lingered. Parents still believed in the rod, still feared spoiling their children with too much affection. Boarding schools still demanded silence at dinner, still strapped posture boards to slouching shoulders. The workhouses did not vanish overnight, and many children continued to labour in fields and factories long after reformers declared victory. Change came slowly, unevenly, like the cautious creep of dawn across the London rooftops. You walk among the crowd, your footsteps lost in the roar of voices. A boy no older than 12 stands on a crate, shouting slogans he barely understands, his voice cracking but fierce. His little sister tugs at his sleeve, half frightened, half proud. Around them, adults march with placards, some demanding shorter working hours, others calling for schools that nurture rather than punish. For the first time, you sense that the strict rules of Victorian parenting are being questioned not only in whispers behind closed doors, but in the open air, in the heart of the city. And then you notice something curious. In the midst of all this anger and urgency, there are still children playing. One boy uses a protest banner as a makeshift kite, laughing as it flaps wildly in the wind. Another group pretends the marching crowd is a parade, skipping alongside as though it were a festival. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the world around them, children will always find ways to play, to imagine, to laugh. It's almost defiant, their way of saying, "You cannot take this from us." The crowd swells, then slowly begins to disperse as the night deepens. Families drift back to their homes, their voices fading into the fog. You stand still for a moment, the silence settling once more around you. The city is quieter now, the torches extinguished, the streets empty. Only the faint echo of children's laughter lingers in the air, mingling with the distant toll of a church bell. As you walk on, the fog grows thicker, wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. The streets seem to dissolve, the houses fading into shadows, the sounds of the city growing softer and softer. You realize that your journey through Victorian childhood is drawing to a close. You have seen the rules at the dinner table, the punishments in the schoolroom, the labor in the factories and on the streets, the whispered stories in the nursery, and now the faint stirrings of resistance in the night. The cruelty of Victorian parents was not always born of malice. Often it was born of fear. Fear of poverty, fear of scandal, fear of raising weak children in a world that demanded strength. But the cost of that fear was borne by the children themselves, who learned to hide their laughter, to swallow their tears, to trade their playtime for labor, and to carry secrets heavier than their small shoulders could bear. And yet, amid all this, you've witnessed something remarkable: resilience. Even under the weight of rules and punishments, children found ways to resist. They whispered stories under the covers, carved toys from scraps, laughed in the mud, and turned cautionary tales into comedies. Their joy, fleeting though it was, became an act of rebellion, a spark of humanity in a world determined to smother it. You pause at the edge of the fog, feeling the night grow still around you. The gas lamps flicker faintly, their glow barely piercing the mist. The city seems to sigh, as though weary from carrying so many secrets. And as you prepare to leave this world behind, you realize that the story of Victorian childhood is not just about cruelty. It is about endurance, about the ability of children to find light even in the darkest corners, about the small rebellions that kept their spirits alive. And now, as your journey through the soot-covered streets comes to an end, you let the foe close around you one final time. The voices of the children fade into silence, leaving only the soft hum of the night. The world around you begins to slow. The gaslight flickers, then dims until it is no more than a faint glow in the darkness. The fog that once clung to the streets now feels like a blanket, wrapping you gently, muffling every sound. You feel yourself floating, weightless, as though the heavy rules and punishments of the Victorian world are dissolving into the quiet night air. The children you met, the boys with their hoops, the girls with their dolls, the tiny chimney sweeps and mudlarks, fade into memory. Their laughter lingers for just a moment, soft and distant, like wind chimes on a summer evening. You carry them with you, not as shadows of cruelty, but as sparks of resilience, reminders of how joy finds a way even in the harshest of times. The streets of London dissolve beneath your feet, turning into something softer, quieter. Perhaps a meadow, perhaps simply the edges of your own dreams. The cobblestones give way to something gentler, and you feel your shoulders loosen, your breath deepen, your body finally relax. The stern faces in the portraits, the rattle of the factory machines, the crack of the cane, all of it slips away, like soot washed from stone by rain. Now there is only the sound of your own steady breathing, the hum of the night, and the comfort of knowing you are safe, warm and free. Unlike the children of Victorian London, you are not bound by rigid rules or endless labor. You are free to rest, free to dream, free to laugh if you wish, or simply to drift into silence. So let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the last echoes of the Victorian world fade, replaced by the soft rhythm of your own heartbeat. You are safe here, wrapped in warmth, surrounded by quiet. The city of soot and secrets lies far behind you now, and ahead there is only peace. Rest easy, breathe deeply, let yourself slip into sleep, carrying with you the knowledge of resilience, the memory of laughter in the fog, and the comfort that your world is gentler than theirs. Sweet dreams.